Welcome. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee Meeting 2 for Middle Housing Oregon Homes. Again, for the record, Ben Duncan, Kearns and West, your facilitator. It's great to see people this morning. For those that have joined since I've already asked you to do so, if you could please change your name and with affiliation. That would be really helpful, or RAC member if you don't have an organizational affiliation. So we're going to kind of jump right in. It looks like we do have critical mass. I'll do a little bit of our housekeeping for the morning, and we'll jump into our agenda. So if we go to the next slide. All right. So just as a reminder, this is a Zoom meeting that's being recorded and live streamed. So part of the reason we're asking you to have a name and affiliations to ensure that members of the public who are participating and observing this process understand who's who in the room. We do have closed captions available if that's helpful for your participation. If you go on the bottom of your screen, depending on your version, you can click more. And then go to show captions, and that will have closed captioning as we have this conversation. We do encourage, and I see some folks already in this space, to have cameras turned on whenever it's possible, at least to feel like we're in the room together, but also for building community. Again, rename yourself, include name and affiliation. And then we ask that folks are not using the chat for any kind of substantive issues, particularly because it's not visible for the public. But if there are technical issues, we have some staff on hand that can help resolve those. So please don't use the chat for any substantive issues. If you do, I will just bring it into the room and or ask you to speak to it. If we go to the next slide. As a reminder, in order to kind of create the space for the type of conversations that are most valuable in this rulemaking process, we've been really intentional working with the LCD to craft an agenda and meeting objectives that meet the needs of the rulemaking. So we'll ask that you really honor what the agenda that we've picked. We have deliberately created hopefully enough time to have robust conversations. So we ask that you stay on topic, and hopefully folks have continued to do the pre-work, both with the memo and the video recording. We'll ask that folks share the space and balance speaking time. There's obviously times where different levels of expertise will be brought into the room or more relevant, and that's okay. But we'll ask that even within those spaces, you're balancing speaking time. We want you to listen, learn from each other. Try to understand versus just critique, debate, respond. As you do so, being respectful, candid, and to the extent that this group can have productive and constructive conversations, that's going to be most valuable for giving the type of guidance that will reflect rules that will meet the needs across all the different interests in this space. We ask that, as we sometimes say, be hard on systems and soft on people, address issues, questions, but not challenge kind of people or organizations. To the extent that you all can find common ground, we are not required to get to consensus in this room, but it's incredibly valuable when this room speaks with one voice in its guidance and recommendations to the agency. And then finally, really trying to bring and name things as early in the process as possible to help inform the process, to give us time and space to come back to issues, to address issues, discuss issues. So hopefully folks will continue to kind of model these behaviors and really result in a space that is most effective for everyone. If you go to the next slide. So just as a reminder, very high level of your purpose, charge, principles, and members. I'm not going to read the slide to you, but just reminding us what brings us together and the work that we have in front of us. But I will just name, these principles of really finding balance, right? We have a lot of different interests in the room. Finding balance will be critical. Understanding the folks that, have to partner in the work, to do the work, that are on the ground and impacted by this every single day. and really exploring the kind of multiple options and different pathways that this work can go forward. To the extent that we are consistently being transparent in our conversations, naming things early, and bringing our ideas into the room, that is incredibly valuable, and certainly operating in good faith. If we go next slide. So the hope today is in service to some of those charge and purpose and principles, really discussing and providing some input on local ordinance and citing criteria. And hopefully, when we get into these conversations, folks will be able to lift up and respond to the questions that reflect the pre-meeting materials. And providing input on design standards, variances, and adjustments. And in order to support that, if you go to the next slide, we've built an agenda that will start with racial equity framework. Well, actually, we'll do intros here in a minute. But substantively, we'll do some reflection back on the racial equity framework that we'll be asking you to hold throughout this entire RAC process. We'll create some space, recognizing that while we did have a robust conversation at meeting one, we want to reflect back some of those key themes and also just give an opportunity for any additional follow-up reflections or things that have come up since our first meeting. And it says 5 minutes, but we'll give the time that we need without spending our entire meeting looking backwards. And then we'll move into the kind of model that we used in the last conversation. So looking at local ordinance and citing criteria, that intersection, reflecting back on any clarifying questions folks have, and then we move into our deeper dive discussion, particularly around design standards and variances and adjustments. So we'll build a break into that, close the next steps, get you out of here by noon. Before I keep going, Ethan, anything you want to add just contextually or around how we're going to spend our time today?
I don't think so, Ben. I think you've overviewed it well. Lots of time for discussion. Looking forward to that as the kind of core of our meeting today.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's move into, I believe, introductions. If we go to the next slide. And just, I'm going to start, Chair Lazo, I see you here. So I'll just start with you and ask if there's anything that you want to open up with or prompt this group to consider as we go through today's conversation.
Thanks, Ben. I'm Alan Lazo. I'm the chair of the Land Conservation and Development Commission. I use he, him pronouns, and just happy to have you all here, and particularly for things like this, happy to have the expertise we do in this room to go through this. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, appreciate you, Chair. So we'll go in alphabetical order. Maybe we'll switch this up at some point. Although Alexandra, you have the distinct pleasure of being our first A. So starting with Alexandra.
I am frequently the first A in the alphabet. I'm Alexandra Ring. I'm the Housing and Land Use Lobbyist for the League of Oregon Cities. We represent all 241 cities across the great state of Oregon. Happy to be here today.
Thank you. Andy Bolton.
Hi, I'm Andy Bolton. I'm the Acting Manager of Policy and Technical Services at the Oregon Building Codes Division.
Good. Annika? Is Annika here? Brandon, did you make it back? Thought I saw you. Yep, there you are.
I did. Thank you. Brandon Persinger, Association of Oregon Counties. I am the Natural Resources and Land Use Lobbyist for the association. Happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Brandon. Brock?
Hey everyone, Brock Nation, Policy Director at Oregon Realtors.
Thank you. Kathy?
Kathy Rigby. I work with the city of Newport and here just as a regular citizen.
Great, thank you. Cheryl?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Cheryl Bell, and I use she, her pronouns. I am an Assistant Director for the Department of Transportation and Development for Clackamas County.
Good, thank you. Destin?
Destin Verdun, he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Affordable Housing at Polish Commercial Inc.
All right, thank you. Diego?
Hello, Diego Diaz with Housing Oregon and Salem, Yes in My Backyard.
Thank you. Eric Rutledge here?
Yeah, good morning. Eric Rutledge, Community Development Director, City of Sherwood.
Thank you. Fred?
Hi there. Fred Evander, City of Independence, Planning Manager.
Thank you. Jerica, did I see Jerica? Jerry?
Hello, Jerry Lids, individual in Eugene and former LCTC commissioner.
Thank you. Jill?
Hi, I'm Jill Kropp with Studio Kropp Architecture. I work with developers and home builders to do middle housing, primarily in Portland, but also in the metro region. I am also the chair of Portland's, just my brain just shut off.
DRAC,
The
Development Review
DRAC, thank you. Development Review Advisory Committee for the City of Portland.
All
Thanks.
right, see, your friends have your back here, Jill. Appreciate that. Jim?
Jim Taylor, Oregon Housing Disaster Recovery Division, lead the team that is rebuilding homes for wildfire survivors.
Awesome, thank you. Jonathan?
Jonathan Balkema, building official with the City of Albany.
Nora? There you are, Nora.
Hi, I'm Nora Cronin. I'm the Director of Real Estate Development at Dev Northwest. We're a nonprofit affordable housing developer in the Willamette Valley.
I'm just realizing our alphabet is a little off, I guess.
No, it's because I'm stepping in for Karen Sachs from Dev Northwest, who couldn't be here. So,
thank you.
yes.
I was like, wow, we don't know how to do the letters in alphabetical order. Thank you for that reminder, Nora. Lee.
Lee Armstrong, Habitat for Humanity. We do affordable home ownership development in the Portland metro area.
Awesome. Mary Kyle.
Mary Kyle McCurdy. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Associate Director at 1000 Friends of Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Mark Taylor here? I don't see your name, Mark. Morgan?
Morgan Tracy, Senior Planner with the City of Portland, and I'm considering renaming myself to Alex so I can go first next time. Good to be here.
Maybe we'll find a way to mix it up. We'll try to get you up front, Morgan. Shane?
Shane Kwiatkowski, pronoun she, they, independent advocate in the Portland metro region, and I will never change my name to be in anyone else's place. Good morning, everyone.
Boom. Okay. Thank you, Shane. Sarah, I'm sure here. I didn't see. And then Samantha.
Samantha Bear on the phone with the Oregon Home Builders Association.
Okay, and then you see the facilitation team and DLCD staff. So DLCD staff, as you all just jump into the conversation, I'll have you introduce yourselves as we go through the conversation. Did I miss anybody that's joined after their name in the alphabet? Okay. Not seeing any. Let's keep going. So we'll move to racial equity framework. So we'll have a couple slides here. One, just a reminder, the LCDC and DLCD have kind of challenged us in this process to utilize a racial equity framework for decision making. And part of the conversation we had last time really ties to this. So it's really looking at these kind of multiple ways of thinking about impacts to community as the agency and as you all discuss decision making, starting with this, understanding the context and the history, kind of what's gotten us to where we are, some of the benefits and burdens. So understanding impacts as you all have conversations around different policy pathways and decisions to really think about kind of who is impacted by those different decisions and really thinking in the broadest context possible around the different communities and populations that are involved in the work and impacted by the work that y'all do. To think about what is the data that we have, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, bringing story as well as quantitative data into our conversations to form sort of data equity and justice framework. To build up and recognize that community story, voice, and experience should and has and could inform the ways that this work unfolds, and all of that being in service to trying to imagine a future that is reflective of restoration and restorative justice, to hold accountability for good governance, and to certainly give us opportunities to understand the impacts of the decisions we make through outcomes and seeking to always be better. And if you go to the next slide, want to just reflect back, we had a really good conversation around this room at our first meeting, and tried at a very high level to reflect back some. And what I'll ask, you won't see the same type of questions within the discussion today. So I'm going to ask you all to sit with what I'm saying and reflecting back based on what you all described last time, and hold that as we have this conversation, right? To challenge you all to continue to bring in some of these themes as we continue to have conversations around policy pathways. So when we reflected as a group around historical inequities, really a lot of conversation around the exclusion from access, right? And recognizing that many communities, whether it's housing instability, insecurity, houselessness, or lack of access to the type and choice of housing that folks would most benefit from, that we hold that as a historical inequity that has contemporaneous realities as well. We also recognize that some of those barriers and delays can impact development, but also increase cost, which then has these rippling effects, again, to lead towards exclusion. And then finally, what we might call NIMBYism, just, the community maybe distaste for different types of housing. So not in my backyard, to translate the acronym for folks who haven't heard that. When you all reflected on benefits and burdens at a very high level, one of the things we really took away was that, the work that the state is doing and you all are engaged in to produce more housing and different types of housing can reduce costs and improve access. And so those communities that have been excluded, in theory, right, will have more opportunity, more access, more choice, and more types of homes to live in. And then recognizing that the decisions that we make around siting and design can impact both community safety, but also promote community well-being. And there was lots of story around what those can look like and for different communities and populations. From a data perspective, very specifically, recognizing communities of color, communities with disabilities, LGBTQ+ communities are disproportionately housing insecure, right? So centering the communities that we know have experienced kind of the cumulative effect of housing insecurity, of lack of access, of economic mobility barriers, all of these things that we heard bits and pieces of at our last conversation. And then finally, there were some needs that were spoken to from this group around community needs, including multifamily housing access, accessibility, fair housing, community and cooperative models of sustaining community connection, and then finally, just this broad concept of livability. So I reflect that back to you all as a reminder of the conversation we had, but also as a foundation in which I hope you all hold these themes as we continue to have these conversations. Any comments, thoughts, reflections, or questions before we continue on? Okay. I'm waiting my 8 to 10 seconds, as you're supposed to do when you ask a question. Shane, are you pondering? It looks like a pondering look.
Yeah, I am always pondering. There's so many great things to ponder. Sorry, it's okay if there's so much density in here. If we end up having a comment or a concern, maybe later on, can we loop it back to this?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
What I appreciate that you just said is looping back to this. So it could be comments and questions around what's on this slide and the conversation we've had. Just as importantly, I want you to loop back to this in your mind as we have the conversations going forward. Jump in, Shane, and then Catherine.
And the sentence I could say is, I'm really just trying to always have the forest, trees, landscape, mountain, sky perspective, right? It's a very fractal relationship. So what I'm thinking right now is, how do I take these things and then in the purview of what we're talking about right now with the specific design standards, really trying to think, okay, from my qualitative perspective of advocacy and knowing marginalized communities from a lived experience perspective, how do I translate their needs and their experiences to things that may meet where the rubber meets the road? So that's the space. So if the face is weird, be distracted by the earrings.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, and that is I think that's a challenge for every single person in this room, Shane. And I appreciate you just articulating, right? How do you take some of this and apply it to the type of conversations that we'll have today? Kathy, jump in.
Yeah, so I just had a question, and maybe we will get to this later, but when you talk about the different housing types for this accessibility and fair housing, specific line item. I wonder if there is a model that doesn't take away from density where the lower level is accessible for somebody in a wheelchair, let's say, and the upper levels can still be accessed by those that don't have those requirements, so that there isn't a takeaway from, like out here on the coast would be, a stacked townhouse or something like that. So we don't remove density, but we still have the lower levels accessible as needed for that community. So I'm sure you'll get to that when we get to those models, but it would be nice if that was built into the system.
Well, it might be just, Ethan, if you want to jump in, right? Because there's kind of two parts of this parallel process around kind of the building code and design standards and then what we're discussing. Do you want to kind of reconcile that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about this Oregon Homes program from the perspective of this DLCD rulemaking, it does not consider those like what is in the building necessarily, like how the pre-approved plan itself, the building itself, what characteristics that building has within it, what the number of units are, what the breakdown of how many units and how they're organized within the structure. That's out of scope for the conversation that DLCD is having on rulemaking related to rulemaking. However, I would say when we think about ways to, especially in today's conversation around design standards, when we think about ways to think about what those, I don't know, what you might call them, values or the way that the developments kind of work for the people who live within them, I think that is well within scope. And that could manifest itself in terms of the access to those units, for example, or the way that those are organized on the lot, for example. So we can get into the specifics a little bit more, but I just do want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we are not talking about the kinds of units, the characteristics, the number of bedrooms within each of those units. That is out of the scope of this conversation.
Yeah, so thank you, Ethan. And Kathy, and I guess for everybody, right? Like we can keep having that clarification of scope. So I just encourage folks to bring things into the room and then we can clarify whether it's in scope for this process or not. I'll also note, and Andy, I'll look at you, but I had to kind of comment, there is a parallel process. So we do have building codes division here. So, I would hope, right, that some of that you may be hearing, Andy, some of the things that are raised here that aren't part of this process that might be able to be kind of married into this parallel process around building codes and kind of a standard design.
But let's definitely, continue this line of conversation in the discussion related to design standards, because I think there are some conversations that we need to have as a rulemaking advisory committee. Yes, about let's try to poke the bounds of that scope and figure out where it is. But also,
and just to be clear, I wasn't wanting to talk about the characteristics. So sure. I'm saying that if you're going to have this preferential route of designs, the designs have to be inclusive of what's needed in the community, which you've just brought up, right? Mm-hmm. So the alignment has to be there, that you do offer that in that group of things that you're offering, not talking about what's offered inside, but there has to be a model. Otherwise you're missing a whole section of a community need that you've just outlined.
Yeah. And again, Kathy, I think to Ethan's last point, let's keep bringing it in, right? And let's find the places where that conversation can inform this particular set of rules. Jonathan?
I was just going to add, excuse me, from the building code perspective. So once we go over the 3 units, so once we go to the 4th unit, we end up triggering fair housing, which then would require all those first floor units to be type B units, so they're adaptable. So that framework's already there for a lot of things. So like if Andy's team creates a ready build plan or permit ready plan now around that new stacked duplex style townhouse like thing to get a 4-plex, those bottom units would have to be type B units anyway. So some of that will already be captured within the building code.
Thanks, Jonathan. So Morgan, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to ask folks to save this conversation for the application and the discussion we're going to have. But Morgan, jump in.
That's fine. Well, let's save it for the siding designs discussion. I just
Okay.
want to, yeah.
You don't have to.
Well, I just reacting to Jonathan's comment. I've heard this invocation of the fair housing at 4 units in a building, and that's true. My understanding is for townhouse construction where you're 4 or 5 or 6 units in a row, those are individual structurally independent buildings, and the Fair Housing Act isn't triggered when you have 4. So those fourplexes that we're seeing built in Portland aren't being built to a type B standard. Those, yeah. So
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. So again, let's move this conversation to discussion. But right, Kathy, thanks for kind of illuminating, right, a conversation that we should and need to be able to have. And you're already seeing some of the complexities of both the intersection of these two processes, but some of the complexities of like, how do you hold an equity analysis as you go through rulemaking process? Ethan, did you want to add anything else before we keep going?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add, and I look forward to continuing this when we get to that point, but when we talk about the kinds of housing and how those housing types, when we're talking about the actual development itself, are meeting the needs of Oregon's communities, we have to recognize that we have a smaller, less impactful role that this group has on that conversation. But the conversation around how the development feasibility of those types comes into play and the standards that are vetted through this rulemaking advisory committee process stack on top of each other and in theory add more potential barriers to the development of those various housing types. That's something we really need to deeply consider in this conversation, not only today, but throughout the rest of the Oregon Homes rulemaking process. Like there are good cases to make for particular design standards, but we need to constantly balance that with, are we adding too much to the stack such that it falls over and we've kind of upset the development feasibility in the first place for those housing types, right? That's going to be a real tough balance, and I look forward to having that conversation in more detail here in just a couple minutes.
Absolutely. One of the principles that I reflected earlier is that balance that you're describing. All right, well, let's keep moving. Thank you for y'all for naming what you did. So we did want to create a little bit of space, if you go to the next slide, to reflect back and provide a bit of time for you all if there's things that came up between the last meeting and today. And certainly we kind of put this out in more detail with the meeting summary, but some of the key themes to just reflect is, we talked about the rule pathway and how do you kind of find that structural balance in rule, and this real desire that folks articulated between kind of home type and lot type, with an emphasis on lot type. And I don't remember exactly who said it. It was like, the lot is the challenge or some iteration of that, that really kind of popped up, and a lot of heads nodding. That it was really important as we go through this process to have clear and objective rules that can have predictable outcomes and clarity around what those requirements are to ensure that development is efficient, right, but also holds some of these really important pieces around quality of life and community character. And then finally, that the building codes and the assumptions that are within those, but as well as some of these things that we'll also be talking about a little bit today, trash, parking, utilities, fire safety, these other things that kind of overlay with not just the building itself, but the land and property and amenities around it, as well as kind of the requirements of community. So just wanted to reflect back a bit about key themes, and then wanted to open up some space. Ethan, I guess I'll pass it to DLCD first if there's some other kind of follow-ups that you all took away, and then I'd love to invite the group if there's things that have come up for you that you want to just bring into the room today.
Yeah, particularly if you all have been reflecting on that first meeting of, oh, I thought that went entirely different than I was expecting it, or we had a totally different conversation than I was expecting we were, or I was bummed to hear that this was out of scope or something like that. Those kind of things I think would be useful in this conversation. I did want to follow up on a few things. The siting and design standards, I mean, that was one of the key elements of that first meeting to talk through, how do you go about a structure of establishing those siting standards? Do you apply those to the housing types, or do you just apply those to a base lot and whatever can be built within the areas that are not shaded out, kind of that's the housing that we might see being built on that lot. And I thought that discussion was really helpful in terms of trying to figure out, like, how is this actually going to work and how will those rules actually shape up? So I appreciate that conversation. I did have a follow-up from a question you asked, Brock, around buildable area. I said I would follow up on that one. For folks who are looking at the bill, this is related to some text in section 2, subsection 4, subsection B of the bill, speaks to buildable area of housing types that receive this kind of Oregon Homes treatment. And thinking through that buildable area definition and having some conversations, it seems like that is in relation to the areas behind kind of like the front door, I suppose. Would not include areas like those covered bike parking areas, for example, or trash areas, or those like common covered courtyards or something like that. So I just wanted to follow up on that when we're thinking about the actual size of units and buildable areas and what's eligible and all that kind of stuff. We can hold that kind of, I don't know, call it a loose definition in our minds. And if we want to have some more conversation around that, we certainly can. But
Well, let's
those
go.
are my report outs, Ben.
Awesome. Thanks, Ethan. Let's go Brock and then Shane. Brock.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. Appreciate the clarification. So I guess the kind of one question that I have still is whether or not for A versus B, it applies to like the footprint of the development or the square footage of the unit. As I mentioned last time, I think the way I read it, A sounds more like footprint, B sounds more like unit size. It explicitly says unit size. But doesn't have to be right now, but eventually if we could get an answer on that.
Okay, so I want to, dive a little bit deeper on that.
Thank you.
All right, Shane.
Great. And maybe this is a good time to state it, but even preparing for this meeting, I thought that between the first meeting and then having one with Ethan and someone else, I thought my understanding of what the scope is, what is specifically affected was better. And then the meeting starts in the first 30 minutes and I'm like, oopsie poopsie. I don't know if I necessarily know the distinction. For example, when Kathy was bringing up the conversation of, accessible unit versus not. And I'm like, ooh, what a great idea. And it's like, yeah, it's a great idea, but it turns out it's not in the scope of this. So I'm just stating a little bit of confusion still, and maybe secondly, a request of anytime anyone brings up a conversation related to a design standard that may help really define it, if you can just explain it to me like I'm 5 and just say, this is a great example of something that is within our purview. One might think that's closely related, but here is a distinction. That way, I'm just really trying to figure out the boundaries because I appreciate being here. I just want to know I'm talking about the right things.
Yeah,
sounds good.
Yeah, any thoughts? I mean, what I heard you say earlier, Ethan, is we're going to keep exploring those boundaries. And so, Shane, I think there's probably others that are going to want to get up to that edge and find that edge, and we'll have to continue to clarify kind of where that is. So I don't know, Ethan, if that's a fair reflection, but that's what I thought I heard you say is like, we're going to have to name these things and see how far we can get as it relates to these rules before we just say that's in or that's out.
Yeah, and I'll plan to speak to that a little bit on this in the next section about the relationship between Oregon Homes and local development standards, particularly on that point of when we talk about design standards, we're really talking about what you see maybe from the sidewalk onto a site. You're not opening the door, like the curtains are closed on the windows. You don't see what's inside the building. It's only kind of what you are experiencing as you are looking upon that lot. Those are the kinds of standards that we're looking at, not necessarily like how the floor breaks or where the door openings are, who those units are necessarily designed for, an interior sense.
Awesome. Great. And I appreciate this. And even just having that sentence, I'm like, oh crap, there's a difference between being inside of a unit versus you're looking at a unit from a sidewalk. So I really appreciate those kinds of examples. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for, Shane, for kind of continuing to push. I don't know if we'll all channel our inner 5-year-old, but certainly pushing for like what is a good example that kind of illustrates the conversation we're trying to have. Kathy, and then Jonathan.
Yeah, so that's where I find the conversation about the needs that were identified a little confusing, because if we're saying that speeding up this process helps us meet these needs, that's confusing, because if we're only looking at the outside of the building, we haven't identified that we've met those needs. So I hate to go to my community, let's say, and advocate for something that we don't know if meets the needs, right? Our community might need a lot of density. We need a person in every floor. But you said this, one of the purviews of this is that we're going to meet these needs. But are we? So I would temper that discussion if we're not going to actually show anything that helps meet the needs. And we're just talking strictly, what do you see with your eye on the outside?
That's fair. So maybe Kathy, just really quickly, and then we'll go Jonathan, then Brandon. I think what I was reflecting back that I hear you responding to is that we have to understand what those communities needs, and we're operating within the context of this rulemaking, right? And so that might just be a point of frustration that we hold, and we have to be pushing. And I say you all have to kind of push to say, like, how do we kind of marry what we understand the needs of community to be within the confines of this rulemaking? And there's not much we can do about changing the confines of the rulemaking, but we can keep trying to push for, like, how do we get as close as we can to reflecting on kind of that equity framework. So again, I think the discussions will help us continue to navigate through this. But I really appreciate how you all are already trying to center kind of the equity framework as the way that we have this conversation. Let's go Jonathan, then Brandon, and then if there's not any other comments, maybe this is a good transition into the discussion and conversation.
And Alexandra, if you just didn't see her, sorry, just want to make sure she's there.
Oh yeah, now I do. You snuck in. So what was it? Jonathan, Brandon, Alexandra? Yep.
This one may be for Ethan, just for the framing for the committee. Theoretically, couldn't they, if the will of the committee was to propose rule that offered a trade-off incentive that is often found in land use for accessibility, couldn't that be incorporated into it, such as, since we're going to be talking about adjustments and those sorts of things, using the mandatory adjustment criteria? I can't remember what the number ended up being, but it was, you get one more mandatory adjustment if it's related to accessibility or something like that. Couldn't that be a possibility of the committee if they wanted to go that way?
Right, definitely. We'll be talking about those variances and adjustments. And one of those, I think, considerations that we should discuss is if there is that trade-off, right? One of those examples that I provided in the materials was, if we could use this kind of outcomes-based approach, if we have, I use the example of you could squeeze an additional unit in there if you allow an adjustment to some maximum lot coverage standard, for example, because it provides an additional unit, that might be a good outcome. Therefore, we might allow that adjustment. We could have a similar conversation around what those outcomes-based kind of adjustments should be or could be. I think that's definitely within the scope of the conversation of how those adjustments, shake out and why those adjustments are able to be invoked in the first place.
That's great. Thank you, Jonathan. So let's go Brandon, then Alexandra.
Thanks, Ben. I think I have a question for Ethan, specifically about this slide. Clear and objective standards there. It says rules should clearly state what requirements. 197A400 doesn't give us a choice, right? They must be clear and objective standards. So I think if we're gonna summarize on some of these slides, and I really appreciate the fact that DLCD staff is summarizing, key themes from last week or last meeting, and things for the RAC to focus on going forward. I think if there is a statute that is requiring us to do something, I think we need to make sure that we identify that. So, right, we have to be clear and objective. We don't have a choice there. And then building code assumptions are important considerations. I think building code, right? The last thing we want is to give a certification of occupancy, let people move in, and then turns out the building codes didn't have certain considerations and the house falls down, right? So I think we just need to all be on the same, I don't want to say level, because I don't know if that's the right word, but I just want to make sure that if there are requirements that have to be met, they have to be met, and we're not listing them as optional. Thanks.
Yeah, Brandon, we'll take that as a note, and maybe it's a footnote. I mean, what we're doing is reflecting back on the conversation that people maybe name things that are in statute, and that's not as clear as maybe it could be. So we'll just make that note as we work with the agency to kind of both summarize and to put out key points. Alexandra?
Yeah, really agree with Brandon. I think I'm just really concerned about scope creep. This group has a very specific scope, and while I appreciate that there are concerns outside that scope, that's where we tend to run into issues with these RACs and how cities can implement them. It ties really into that clear and objective problem, all of those things where like we have to make this something that is implementable for our cities and our counties, which means that the scope was very narrow for a reason. And is that, necessarily mean that this will be the most, impactful bill on planet Earth? No, probably not. But there is a reason why that scope was narrow. There is a reason why these are the only considerations that we have. And when we talk about these things, and I worry a little bit that we will, let the good get in the way of the implementable, and that really should be our goal here, is something that cities can actually do.
Right. Thanks, Alexandra. Well, between you and other cities, right, there'll be a filter and a lens in which I hope folks bring those perspectives into the space, and just reflecting back on this relationship between kind of scope, purview, boundaries, and outcomes. That's the challenge that this group gets to navigate together. So I appreciate you naming it. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, others. With that, I'm not seeing any other hands in the queue. So Ethan, do you want to move us into the next part of the conversation?
Yeah. I think we've already gotten into some of it. So let's keep going. Wanted to spend a little time, not much, but spend a little time just making sure that there was coming out of that discussion from the first Rulemaking Advisory Committee. I think we could all benefit from, and I'm already hearing it today, a little bit of further description of how the Oregon Homes program is intended to work within the local regulatory framework. And hopefully that helps with the later discussions we'll have around design standards and what's in scope, what's out of scope. And I wanted to just touch on two particular points. The first being that the Oregon Homes program, and if you watch the pre-recording materials, I did touch on this, so hopefully this is not all that new, or you're not hearing it for the first time. But the Oregon Homes program is a program that is designed to take a known quantity, the building itself, that is pre-approved, ready to go. It meets all of the building code requirements, bringing that into a development context where it benefits from a more streamlined, standardized set of regulations at the local government that kind of cuts through all of the local government's existing siting and design standards for other housing types that they might allow in their jurisdiction. So it's kind of And that happens in all jurisdictions. If a builder has their pre-approved plan, they take it to City X, to Rainbow City, they get the same exact standards that are applied, and from a siting and design standard perspective, as they would in City Y or City Z. It's the same exact process, the same exact standards. That doesn't, though, preempt a local government from applying their other standards that they have on the books currently to non-Oregon home projects or applications that they might get in their jurisdiction. But it's important to note that what we talk about here in terms of design standards, siting standards, all of these other elements of our rulemaking scope, we have to know that those standards are the same, are going to work the same in all jurisdictions across the state. And when we also the second piece I wanted to mention when we were having that conversation in the first meeting, wanted to just highlight that when we get to the point of talking about variances and adjustments, those are variances and adjustments to that standardized set of regulations for the use of builders. It's not for allowing City X to have a slightly different standard than City Y when it comes to pick your favorite design standard, pick your favorite siting standard. It is for the purpose of the builder who has their pre-approved plan, goes to City X and applies for development application. They have some oddity, some peculiarity of their development proposal, and they might be afforded the opportunity to vary from the standardized set of standards or to adjust those standards. So I just wanted to hammer home those two key points and make sure that we're all on the same page for at least those elements of our scope as we begin the conversations on the next two elements of our discussion today. So I'm happy to answer any clarifying questions on that, dive a little bit deeper if folks feel like that's necessary. But I want to make sure that we are all operating from those same fundamental premises before we move forward.
Okay, so thank you. Let's kind of stick to clarifying questions for this portion of the conversation because we're going to move into a more in-depth conversation. Sarah, welcome. Jump in.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Sorry I was late to the meeting. Yeah, Ethan, I guess for me, the clarifying question is, especially being on the coast or somewhere where we've got specialized setbacks for different communities, we've got exposure D wind zones, we've got higher ratings, we've got liquefaction, different soil compositions, more rain. How is this going to be integrated for cities and communities, I would say, either west of the Coast Range, or I would even dare say east of the Cascades, where they've got snow loads and other challenges that must be incorporated into their designs. We have rain, they have snow, but same thing. How, in terms of what you're talking about, how does that conversation integrate in?
Sure. So when it comes to again, I'll answer your questions here, but I do want to just use this as an opportunity to say that these are conversations about the building itself, by and large, right? And the manner in which that structure can withhold the elements of its surroundings. Those parts of the general conversation around Oregon homes are not parts of the conversation that we will be having here as part of this rulemaking process. When it comes to the in DLCD's rulemaking process, when it comes to how that would be managed or be incorporated into the consideration of the actual structure for the context in which it's built, again, Andy, I don't want to continually put you on the spot, but those elements of the actual structure itself do seem like it's something within the pre-approval status of that building codes might offer to those individual developments. I get that about right, Andy?
Oh, sorry. there's the process for for publishing a permit ready plan as it's sort of was created last year is there's built into that process sort of a interaction with local building departments where the plans will be sort of distributed to local building departments for review, a 30-day review period, and will this work in your jurisdiction? If it won't, tell us why. The plan, as the plans are being developed, the goal is to have it be as broadly applicable as possible. But if it goes out to a jurisdiction, there will be an opportunity for the jurisdiction to say, this won't work here, here's why. And that will either be, if it's possible, the plans will be changed and it'll be updated to where it can apply everywhere. Or if it's absolutely necessary, there may be a situation where it's like this specific plan cannot work in this specific area if there's just no way to make it work. But there's that opportunity to comment and to give feedback, and that's a strictly like the local jurisdiction building department getting back to us on that, and that's where the engagement is on that. And that's prior to those plans being published.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that because I'm just even thinking about cost. All of those elements substantially start changing the cost and altering the design, right? Especially with foundations. So thank you. I appreciate that. And I look forward to seeing those plans.
Yeah, and I think, Sarah, for this conversation, for the folks in the room, I mean, I think what you just said, Andy, will this work in your jurisdiction is a fundamental question that this group needs to hold and bring forth, right? So as we have these conversations for Tillamook, right, will this work in your jurisdiction? What are the unique attributes within Tillamook that we need to bring into this rulemaking so we don't go down a path where there's conflict, tension, or things that just will not work based on the uniqueness and specificity of your geography, jurisdiction, space and place. So again, I think that's a really, Andy, I'm just going to steal that is like, will this work in your jurisdiction for the folks that are representing jurisdictions, representing place? Like, what is that? How do we answer that question? Maddie, I saw you put a hand up. Did you want to add some additional context, and then we'll go to the other hands raised?
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Madeline Phillips. I'm the Public Facilities Planner with the DLCD Housing Division. Also here supporting Ethan as a former local government planner who did a lot of plan review and building permit issuance. Sarah, you bring up a great point, and I just wanted to highlight in this context, your question is so apropos. The question, the part of the question about the building structure itself and its consistency with the building code is one part of the question. The other part of your question had to do with eligibility of lots and the unique geography of places. And I think what needs to be clear also in the rulemaking that we proceed with here is that not all lots are going to fit the development types that are created through the Oregon Homes program. So there will be unique site characteristics and challenges, especially, and Ben, to your point that you emphasized at the beginning, that the lot is the hard part. For some geographies in Oregon, that's going to be a real challenge to find eligible lots that fit an Oregon home. And our discussion together is going to focus on how do we set the parameters for the eligibility, what's the size and scale of the footprint that's required for each of these housing types in order to qualify an eligible lot. So in Tillamook or on the coast, that might have some characteristics, there might be some lots that are not eligible because they have unique soil characteristics or other things that make it really difficult to qualify this specific Oregon home. And I want to make sure that we're cognizant of that. A lot of our focus of the conversation will be on what are the eligibility criteria for lots, and how do we placement of certain housing types can fit on those lots given their buildable area or the availability of them. So thanks for raising that.
Thanks, Maddie. Let's go Cheryl, Alexandra, Jill, Samantha, Brandon. Cheryl.
Yeah, thank you. And Sarah, I really appreciate you bringing that forward in a county like Clackamas County, where we have urban and rural. We have Clackamas County Town Center. Sure, y'all been there. We also have Mount Hood. Sure, y'all been there too. So those siting criteria and having a wide range of ability to apply these buildings is a challenge for us just because of our geography. But really, I guess, and I don't know if there's a clarifying question or as we go since Ethan, but talking about, it sounds like truly what we'll be doing here is overriding existing local density standards and other local standards in setting an Oregon home. When I was talking with my team, my land use planning team and our planning director, there was concerns about all of these becoming non-conforming uses and how we manage that in the land use perspective. Because there's just, making a bunch of non-conforming uses, then we have to manage those over time. And I know that Alexandra said it really well, I think in her last comment about just this, the more simple we can do this for local jurisdictions, the better we can deploy it and get these tools in the ground to give the needing housing. So just something as we're thinking about this, there's complexities in making those choices to override local zoning laws.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. So I appreciate your comments. I'm going to ask folks if there are clarifying questions, please keep those. And I'm going to want us to say some things for discussion. So just, I think Alexandra, then Jill, then Samantha, then Brandon.
I have some comments for discussion. I think I have one kind of clarifying question, which is around something that came up from what Sarah said and the response from BCD. It is not the understanding of LOC or I don't believe AOC that we have any option to say no to these homes being built in any jurisdiction, nor that BCD really has the ability to say that these homes are restricted to certain like geographic areas. If that had been a consideration in the legislation, that would have been great. It's not there as far as I can tell. If I'm operating from like a wrong set of standards, that's fine. But like, that's part of the reason why local jurisdictions have siting and design standards is because of the variance in our wind shear and snow load and all of those things.
Yeah. Ethan, did you want to reflect back?
Well, I definitely won't speak for the building codes portion of it, but when we talk about lot eligibility or where this applies, that's all provided in the statute. The lot eligibility portions of this conversation outside of, and I'll put a little nuance in the things that Maddie was saying, and then I'll hand it off to you, Andy. But when we talk about like which lots are eligible for development of Oregon homes, we're not talking about like where in a city lots are eligible. Those parameters, those frameworks are provided to us in House Bill 2258. When we talk about like in the context of which lots are eligible for which housing types in terms of siting standards, the conversation we had in the last meeting, there might be situations where, the eligibility, the ability to build a single occupancy dwelling is different because of the lot constraints and the way that the lot is crafted and how those standards fit. And so therefore you might only be able to build a cottage cluster or a duplex or something like that. So I do want to just be clear that you are right, Alexandra. The where in a jurisdiction or which jurisdictions have Oregon lots that are eligible for the development of an Oregon home, that's provided to us in statute. We are not discussing changing that eligibility in any way. But Andy, if you wanted to speak to the building codes portion of that, and then I think it's worth a follow-up question that you might have, Alexandra.
Sure. So the review period that I was talking about with the plans, the permit ready plans, that is prior to like the approval and publishing of the plans at all. So they would not be approved to be used anywhere when that review is happening. And the reason for that review is because like it's for a local jurisdiction to say like, this is why these built, like this is why it doesn't work with the code in our jurisdiction. Once the plans are actually approved to be used, a building department in a local jurisdiction would not have the authority to say like, this does not meet the building code because it's already been approved to meet the building code. There is still going to be a local review process for specific site conditions, but they won't be able to actually override the approval of the plan as meeting the statewide building code.
Alexandra, you don't look satisfied, so jump in.
that was the point that I was getting to. Earlier comments seemed to imply that there was some kind of option for local government to be able to say no, even if in that approval process for the original plan. And that's what makes me nervous is like, how many jurisdictions have to say that this works for them before the jurisdiction that says this does not work for our community? Like, where is that tipping point? And I know that's not necessarily a conversation for this body, but like that is part of the reason why siting and design standards are so important is because we don't have that ability to say no afterwards. Because once that building plan is approved, and that's more what I'm trying to get to is like, that is part of the reason why local governments have siting and design standards outside of the building code. And that's what we're here to talk about is for those safety considerations, those like very real things that, you know, this is not going to apply to all of the lots in Oregon. Like you have FEMA buyout like impacts on some lots. That's just not a practical use for these. But I'll leave that for now and I'll let my
But Alexander, you're previewing the conversation that we're hoping to move into, right? Is to try to uncover what is that uniqueness, what are those places that just don't align or that have constraints that don't make it possible, right? So we do want to move into that conversation. Let's go. It was Jill, then Brandon, then Samantha, and then y'all are clamoring to get into conversation under the guise of clarifying questions. So I'm going to move through the three of you, and then I want us to really jump into the meat of today's discussion. Jill?
Hi, I do think this is just a clarifying question.
Thank you.
I feel like I need some clarity about how Building Codes Division is approving plans because based on the presentations, the video presentations for today's meeting, it was confusing to me if somebody has a floor plan, say, and it's a floor plan that could be a cottage in a cottage cluster. It could also potentially be a unit in a townhouse. Like it's the same floor plan, but it could be used differently. I'm wondering, does Building Codes Division, are they approving the specific design? Like this is a 4-unit townhouse. And if you wanted it to be a 6-unit townhouse, that would be a totally different approval. So that's all I'm needing to know right now.
Is that an Andy question? Yeah, Andy.
I mean, right now the plans that we're planning on contracting out to have designed are an ADU and a single family home. Right now, that's what's planned in the near future. We're not planning any multi-unit permit ready plans at the moment. It's not just like for the permit ready plans, it's not just anybody brings in and we approve it here at the division and then they can go wherever they want. It's very specifically we're contracting with an architecture firm to have the plans designed and then we're licensing them to be published and used over the code cycle. There's an entirely separate process for master plans where developers could bring in a plan and have that approved for their use, but that is not something that we're planning on having tie into Oregon Homes in any way. It's just sort of a separate pathway for getting pre-approved plans, and it's different from this process.
Okay, that's good to know. I didn't know. I thought it was for both tracks. So, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Brandon, then Samantha, and then I'm going to move us into the next part of the conversation.
Thanks. A couple clarifying questions, I think, for Andy and the folks at DLCD. So I guess first, I guess for Andy, how many local jurisdictions does it take for us to say these plans are not going to work before building code says, you're right, we need to redo the plan, right? Like I was working this bill along with Alexandria during the session, and I would agree with her. Local governments don't have the ability to say no. So I guess I need some help understanding what happens when a local government says this isn't going to work here.
the review that we're anticipating from the local building departments is sort of, does it not work from a code perspective locally? So is there is the house designed such that the snow load in our area will make this house collapse? Like that would be the type of feedback where getting it back, like it's not going to get approved for that jurisdiction under those circumstances. I would be surprised if it went out the door under those circumstances for review, but like that is the type of review we're talking about on that the building department review. Things that where like this should not be approved under the code. Like if someone brought this plan into me as a one-off in a specific jurisdiction, we would not approve it for these code reasons. And that's the feedback that we're looking for. In terms of how many, what the tipping point is, we haven't done permit-ready plans for residences before, so this is a little bit of a new process, but we're anticipating it being like if a specific jurisdiction says that it can't work here for X, Y, and Z code reasons, it would either be we're changing the plan to make it work there so that it does comply with the code in that jurisdiction, or when we approve the plan, we approve it for other areas of the state outside of that jurisdiction and is not approved for use in that jurisdiction.
Yeah, so Andy, I appreciate your generosity, and Brandon, I appreciate your questions. This is not a conversation, like we've been having a conversation of scope. I'm going to ask you all to take it offline for building codes. If that's okay. Like, you might have other questions for Andy, and Andy, I appreciate you being here and responding. I'm going to go to Samantha, and Andy will not put
Okay,
you
well, I
on
have
the
two
spot.
questions, but one is for Andy, it is clarifying. So this process is not the process where we're talking about the master plans where the builders can bring in their own plans to be approved and used again?
Correct.
Is there a different RAC for that?
That is existing statutory authority for the division. We're already reviewing some plans from that.
But I think the short answer is there's not a RAC that's been established for that conversation. It's a building codes division authority that's moving forward. So I'm going to encourage, Ethan.
I would also say, even if there was a different rulemaking advisory committee, that conversation would have to happen there, not here. That conversation is not what we, okay. All right.
I'm aware of your guys' authority. I just wanted to clarify because, and I think I appreciate, Ben, that you're getting frustrated, but you have to understand that many of us were a part of legislative conversations and like a lot of background conversations with each other. And so it's just, we're coming to this RAC with a body of information. And so it is a little confusing based on some things being said. And I just needed that clarity for my own members and understanding which process this is so their expectations can align.
That's fair. Yep.
And yeah, my just next follow-up question on that is, I think building codes is actually pretty straightforward. I have a lot more concerns on how this is feasible with the site eligibility. And I know there's going to be a lot of discussion on that, but my question is is there going to be a time of reflection in this RAC process where we might all need to discuss whether or not legislatively there needs to be additional changes for this idea to make sense? Because we've been on RACs, many of us with each other, where we're just bumping up against issues and statutes. And so will there be something baked into this RAC process where we reflect upon whether additional legislative changes must be made?
I would say probably no, that we won't, because we'll be implementing just the statute as it exists. And if those pinch points or ceilings that we bump up against in the implementation of Oregon Homes to make it work, those are conversations that are likely better had outside of a rulemaking advisory committee space. We can highlight those in terms of the instances where we are proposing rules to the Land Conservation Development Commission, for example, because it fits within the framework of what existing statute asks us to do. But in terms of ongoing legislative fix conversations, probably not in the rulemaking advisory committee space itself, but in other things that are happening outside of the RAC. But Alexis is here to correct
Yeah,
me.
so Alexis, I see your hand. You're going to be the last one to speak before we move into the conversation. I really do want to, it sounds like folks are preemptively kind of articulating concerns, and I want to apply those concerns to our discussion so we can really dive into where these conflicts exist. But Alexis, you want to jump in and talk about the politics a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to flag and reaffirm Ethan's point that we do have a task here that we are going to fulfill of adopting these rules, and if there are issues that we realize in this conversation that are legislative in nature, we are happy to convene a conversation with the governor's office and folks that share an interest in coming to the legislature for fixes on this. So we can have that conversation, but this RAC should be dedicated on arriving at rules that we are going to adopt this year.
Okay. Thank you for that. All right. Let's keep going. So Ethan, you want to move us into the next part of the discussion?
Sure. Yeah, good discussion so far. I think I will start first by saying when we have this conversation about Oregon homes and the scope of work, DLCD and Ben, I'm sorry to all of you, but we will continue to beat that drum of we are not having conversations about the building itself. You will hear that over and over again from us. And I'm sorry that that's going to sound like a broken record. But it's just DLCD doesn't have any authority to, and in terms of trying to make the Oregon Homes program work the best that it can, that conversation is something that needs to happen with the experts and the folks who administer the building code in having that conversation. So please bear with us when we continually try to put those bumpers on the lane and continue down our lane in our rulemaking authority. So with that disclaimer caveat, I'll jump into the next section here, which is related to design standards. So I think one of the important pieces that I tried to articulate in those pre-recorded materials is that, again, on this point of when we talk about design standards in the scope of land use review and the manner in which local governments approve the development proposal, we're talking about design standards that do not alter or impact the building envelope or the manner or that jeopardize the pre-approval of the actual building itself. So those are, I would say, not things necessarily like front facade glazing of the windows. Like that would, if each city, if we were talking about standards in the Oregon home context that required, I'm picking a number, 25% of the front facade to be glazed with windows, but building codes is pre-approving plans that don't meet that metric because they don't need to meet that metric to be compliant with the building code standards. You see the conflict there. Inherently, those pre-approved plans cannot meet the standards of a local government from a design perspective for all the good reasons why we might want windows. We wouldn't be able to have that structure in place that would alter, because it would alter the pre-approval status of those Oregon homes. So I think really wanted to make sure that we're all, and it sounds like we're getting closer and closer to a general understanding of how, like what is in scope in that conversation of design standards, because there is this kind of known quantity, and this is unusual, I would say, in the folks who have gone through development processes before, where you have this like known quantity, your pre-approval of the building, that you're just taking and seeking to develop that exact structure on a lot with anywhere within the state of Oregon, which is different. And architects, builders in the room should chime in on this. It's just a different posture that you're entering into that conversation compared to a situation where you might have a general sense of what you would like to build, but that is adaptable and dynamic based on the standards that a local government is going to apply to that development proposal. And you are shifting where the front door is, for example, or you are shifting like how that relates to the other building on site. And that just doesn't function in necessarily the same way under the Oregon Homes program. So I'm just trying to like hammer that one home as best I can to set the stage for the discussion about what design standards we'll actually be talking about in this portion of our discussion. So Morgan, I see you have a question. Let's go there first.
Take Morgan's question, and then do you want to bring up the discussion questions on the slides? Let's put those up. Morgan, jump in, please.
Yeah, I don't want to move us backwards, but it might be helpful as we're contemplating the setting and design discussion if we had a little more clarity on some of the terms that I've heard used here today. So we have master plan, pre-approved plans, permit ready plans. I'm not sure I have an idea of what the distinctions are between each of those. I don't want to be wrong about that, and maybe it would help if we were all on the same page about that. And then more narrowly, like, which ones are we addressing as part of this RAC? And I heard some of that, but I just want to be clear about it. Thanks.
Okay. From BCD, at least, two things. There's permit ready plans and there's master plans. Permit ready plans is what we're talking about here. Permit ready plans are plans that have either been developed directly by the division or the division has contracted with someone to develop and provide us the plans, which then are published for folks to use at their leisure. Master plans are not what we're talking about here. Master plans are something that come in from a developer who has designed the plans and is asking for pre-approval on those plans that they meet all code requirements. And they then retain the plans and sort of have the same sort of ability to use those plans as if they were any other just in-house designed plans, but they're separate from the Oregon Homes discussion entirely.
Okay. Is that good, Morgan?
Yeah, so pre-approved plans and permit ready plans, are those synonymous?
Sorry, when I say pre-approved, I just mean like it's sort of the two categories of pre-approved here would be permit ready and master plan. Pre-approved is not a category in and of itself. I'm just sort of describing that both of these sets of plans have been looked at, have been plan reviewed by the division for code compliance prior to being presented to the local jurisdiction.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Fred.
Yeah, just a quick question. So I guess I'm curious, who applies these design standards? Are these applied locally or are these applied statewide to the building plans that are submitted under this?
It would be implemented via the local government review and approval. So at the counter, you know, somebody, an example, a situation, builder pulls one of those pre-approved plans from the building codes division, says, I would like to build this plan in your jurisdiction. That process, that review process that we'll get to later on in this rulemaking process, the city planner, the code reviewer would say, okay, I'm looking at an Oregon home. I'm looking then at the siting and design standards for Oregon homes to apply to that approval or that decision on whether or not to provide the permit for that to that builder to build that Oregon home. So it's not like the local planner calls the state and says, okay, I've got an Oregon home, can you approve this? Or it wouldn't function that way. It happens at the local government level.
Okay, I mean, I'm just gonna, I think if we establish design standards that apply statewide, that people should I mean, how it happens here is people design their homes based on our design standards. If there's statewide design standards that apply, it seems like we should design Oregon homes based on statewide design standards.
Like have that, are you highlighting like a chicken and egg kind of situation where we can't determine the design standards because we don't know the building, and we can't have the building if we don't know the design standards kind of thing?
I guess I'm just saying we probably shouldn't be designing a building until we know what the design standards are. Is what is what I think.
Kathy? And then, so just before you go, Kathy, we put up some discussion questions, so wherever you go, you're gonna go, but we also have some questions that we'd really love folks to reflect back on. Some of those essential siting and design standards that would apply to Oregon homes. What's kind of necessary, when you're overlaying kind of, safety and quality of life, access to nature, some of those quality of life characteristics that folks have named, and then any other standards you can think of that would help to regulate design, but not impact that kind of pre-approval that we just discussed through building codes. So Kathy and then Alexandra. Kathy, you're on mute.
Sorry, I just have a clarifying question. So is this when you would apply, say that the slope criteria that we had in our materials? Is this the point where once someone gets one of those ready-made plans, do they also have to tell us where they intend to build? Because that affects, right, whether it matches. Is this the point where that marries up? And then for individual communities, like I'm on the coast, if the lot size doesn't meet the criteria, then that's an automatic, yeah, that's not possible.
Right. I would say yes to your question, right? The local planner is considering, right, they have the building because the builder is saying, I would like to build this exact structure. And then they're also reviewing the site itself to make sure that, you know, they're checking things like the setback, they're checking things like the ability for that Oregon home to meet those siting and design standards. I think on the question of slope, and Andy, I'll ask you to jump in here. If you could clarify the point that you were talking about before about like there needs to be additional review from a like building code perspective for something like, I don't know, the foundation, I would assume, or the supportive decking that might need to take place for development on a slopey site, a hilly site. Is that true? Is that accurate in your understanding?
Even the permit, once the permit ready plan is approved, it cannot contemplate every single lot in the state. That's impossible. So there is a specific, it doesn't exempt all local review of the building for building code purposes. There's still a local site condition review that has to take place. And if something is flagged in that site condition review that would make the permit ready plan non-code compliant based on the specific conditions of that site, it would just be a matter of the local building department citing to the section of the building code that says this doesn't work here and here's why. But it does, it would need to comply with the typical cite it, write it requirements of requiring things under the building code.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Andy. Yeah.
Alexandra?
I'll just highlight that I think some of the local government confusion is coming from the use of design standards, which incorporates a whole hell of a lot more than what you all are actually talking about. What you're talking about tends to be more of a development standard, tends to be more your setbacks and your like very concrete, like this is where it goes on the lot things, and not the broader scope of design standards that local governments are allowed to consider. So like we'll start there. And I will just say, like, part of the reason why for a lot of local governments, the conversation about what the building code approval actually looks like is so important, is because that influences why it looks functional on the other side of things. Like how these are getting approved, what that approval process looks like, all of those things have a heavy impact on like what the siting standards that local governments are going to see as implementable are, and like what is actually going to be something that is suitable for like the protection of our communities and making sure that these homes are upright and making sure that like these are homes that people want to live in our communities. Like those two things, like as much as we want to separate them out as much as possible and understand that those are separate conversations, they're not necessarily something that we can entirely fully just like ignore and section off over there. And then I'll just
Well, I
Eric
guess,
is gonna have more concrete feedback than I am, so.
well, I guess that was maybe the question is like, is there within that comment, are there essential kind of standards that feel really critical to name in this space in this moment?
I mean, you're gonna have to allow for adequate setbacks that local governments, one setback in one community is maybe not going to be the same as in others. You're gonna have to allow for some level of variance there, just because there are things that you can't, statewide account for. You're gonna have to deal with parking and, your other factors that I think not a planner, gonna turn it to Eric, who is a planner, to dig into that more.
Okay, that's fair. And I know that's part of the conversation we're also hoping to have today, but Ethan, jump in and then Eric, come to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Alexander, because I think one of the core questions that DLCD definitely has in this conversation is like when we talk about design standards or even siting standards, like what are those? Like let's boil it down to like the really important ones to think through. And if we have not discussed particular ones that are of interest for folks, either in the very limited examples that I provided in that presentation or that we've been talking about today, like what are those other things? Definitely curious to hear about those. I would also say, I think the Oregon Homes program is actually intended to eliminate that variation that local governments apply in terms of like setbacks is a good example. For Oregon Homes, I'm picking a number. The setback for any Oregon home, like this is a potential outcome of this rulemaking. The setback for any Oregon home in any site in any city in the state is 5 feet side yard setback. And I think that is like, I just want to be clear with folks in this conversation that that is a potential outcome of this conversation, and that there, in the context of Oregon Homes, that there is no variable setback standard that could be applied to Oregon Homes. I just want to be clear about that as an example.
Yeah, Eric, jump in.
Yeah, thanks. Really good discussion. So I'm gonna just answer the question as directly as possible up front. Setbacks, height, parking, to me, and I guess the Sherwood community, those would be the main ones. I do think the context matters as well. I'm not sure if we can get into that, in this rulemaking, or if that's where this, RAC wants to land. But for example, if the density standard isn't going to apply to to the Oregon home, and you can get basically a higher density in a specific zone, the context of that might matter. For even within the Portland region, it might matter. Unfortunately, for example, TriMet is going through major budget cuts right now, so Sherwood's getting lines cut right now, and so a multifamily, development in Sherwood at the edge of the UGB with no transit looks very different in terms of parking need than even the city of Tigard, for example, who might have much more access just being one city over. So if we can get into that type of detail, with the Oregon Homes, I think that'd be preferred, certainly by Sherwood. I guess my other comment on siting and design specifically is, I think that, and this is something that DLCD has put out, the walkable design standards for, I think it was through the CFAC. DLCD and Rulemaking Advisory Committee, I think, did a really good job putting out that document, and it goes into windows and building orientation and other standards, all kind of to promote climate-friendly communities. And so I think those are potentially a really good starting point for design that can be design standards that would be appropriate for considering in terms of these Oregon homes. And then I just had a few other comments. I don't know if this is really the right place, but I just wanted to get it out, just on the record, get it out. Some of the things I'm thinking about in terms of implementation, conditions of approval. So when we go through a land use process, let's say it's a subdivision and developer subdivides 20 or 30 lots, the local that's going to be prior to an Oregon home I guess implementation by a builder or by a developer. So we're just dividing the land. Oftentimes the local jurisdiction and the developer will agree to a condition of approval. And so that might be protection of a specific tree on a specific lot, or a walkway through lots 10 and 9 and 10 to ensure pedestrian circulation, something like that. And my comment is the Oregon homes should take into consideration specific conditions of approval that were placed on those lots. So basically you're not, moving the goalposts on the neighbors or the community. So if the developer agreed to protect a home, put in a walkway, etc., especially if it's on a private lot, future private lot, though, that condition of approval should be maintained when the Oregon home is placed. Otherwise, I think there's be a lot of concern about moving the goalposts through between land use and implementation of the Oregon home. And I don't need a response to all this now. I'm just going to get it all out. PUDs as well. So, PUDs are the discretionary path for a developer. We have a clear and objective path and then a discretionary path. So if the developer chooses a discretionary path, the city and the developer kind of work together to get essentially a unique zoning and a unique, code for that development area. How does the Oregon home then potentially supersede that? And I would say that is potentially moving the goalposts as well between the land use process and the PUD process and the final sort of outcome. The reason I say that is oftentimes cities will give up certain things in exchange for certain things through a PUD process. And so if the city has, say, reduced open space or park space requirement in response, the developer is going to build homes a certain way, have certain, whatever it is, certain park improvement, whatever it is. If the Oregon homes then, supersedes that and allows the developer to go back on those commitments through the PUD, that would be a problem as well. And then actually one more comment, master planned communities. So not the master plans that BCD is talking about, but actual master planned communities, allowed to be planned by local jurisdictions. I think if the Oregon homes can address, whether the Oregon homes kind of supersede that OAR or ORS, whatever it is, would be helpful for us to know up front as well. And then my very last comment, really getting back to the building codes, and I apologize for bringing it up, and maybe my only question, our building official is slammed right now. City of Sherwood has one plan reviewer, one inspector, and he is doing everything. And so the expectation that the local building officials around the state are going to kind of catch from a building code perspective where an Oregon home doesn't work based on the local circumstances, I think is a little, just to be open, a little bit of an unfair expectation. And I don't know if the state law really requires or expected that. I would advocate, frankly, for the Building Codes Division to drill down into the different regions of our state. And if that particular Oregon home doesn't work, the Building Codes Division needs to catch that. I just wonder if, what if the Building Codes Division puts out an Oregon home and says, please let us know if this doesn't work. Everyone's busy, especially in rural communities. And, if it doesn't get caught, then Building Code is just going to issue it. I think that's just really problematic. The Building Codes Division has to take full responsibility for the Oregon homes that get approved. It's my last comment. Thanks.
Just for clarity, planned unit development, PUD? Right, okay.
Yeah, that's the term, yep.
I was like, public utilities district? That doesn't feel like it's relevant to this conversation,
Sorry.
but no, that's all right. Please, I'll try to figure out acronyms, but try to not use them, folks, if you can for access. Let's go Jill, Brock, Kathy, Sarah.
Yeah, I have some siting and design standard suggestions. So based on what we talked about earlier, it sounds like I'm just talking about houses and ADUs. Ethan, could you confirm that? Did he leave?
No, I'm here. Sorry.
Oh.
Like, you better not have.
So when we're talking about the pre-approval that building codes division is providing, yes, ADUs, single family or single unit detached.
Okay, but then this committee is also focusing on houses and ADUs.
From the perspective, sorry, give me a moment on that one, Jill.
Okay, I can talk about houses and ADUs for now. Okay, so I think front door on the front of the building is important. Or it could be on a side elevation if it's maybe within 5 or 8 feet of the front. I think that's important. I think that if there's a garage on the front, I think it's important that I guess I'm a little bit Portland centric. I don't think it should be able to take up more than half of the elevation. I think that parking should not be allowed between the street and the front facade, but only of the front house. So if there was a house and an ADU behind the house, I think that the parking should be allowed to be in front of the ADU if it's not in a garage. I think that front elevation should have a minimum glazing standard. I think default for a lot of jurisdictions is 15%, and that feels about right. I don't think ADUs should have front elevation glazing requirements unless they're on a street, facing a street. Like not behind a house, if that makes sense. Like if it was on a corner lot and the ADU faces us, is like within 20 feet of the street elevation, I think it should have that. But if it's fully behind the house, I don't think that should be required. Setbacks, I think, are trickier to figure out. I'm used to City of Portland, which is 5 on the side and 5 in the rear and 10 in the front. But maybe there needs to be a compromise that's like maybe a little bit more. Or maybe there's a different standard for sort of like I don't know. I guess you're trying not to have different standards, but maybe you need to allow a little bit more in the front and maybe a little bit more in the back, and then the sides stay 5. Parking. And then a pedestrian access to the front door of the house is important. Like so that you can't just go like that. I think they need to have their own pedestrian access to a sidewalk or another right of way versus being allowed to use the driveway as a access to the front door. And then I think there should be well, I'm on the fence about minimum eave extensions and siding. Sorry, window and trim requirements. I think maybe you shouldn't have minimum. Like a common one is a 3.5 inch wide trim around all windows and doors. I don't think you should have that one. I don't think you should have eave requirements because there's plenty of really attractive houses that have no eaves and no trim. I think that's like a good kind of overall for houses and ADUs. Thanks.
Thanks. There's a, Ethan, do you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for all of those, Jill. I wanted to, I think in terms of the should we, do we want to, this is where we get into the question of like I've tried to use this analogy before and I'll try it again here. We are seeing a whole bucket's worth of, or maybe a wheelbarrow's worth of design standards that could be applied to, and are typically applied to residential development. And I think the Oregon Homes program is thinking about like what is a much smaller set of those design standards that are necessary and are that don't add so much detail to that approval process such that we don't ever get the units built in the first place, right? The whole purpose of this program is to have that pre-approval already ready to go. There's, somewhat minimal design standards, siting standards that local government applies. So we move right into the development of those units. And so this is really where I want this conversation to go of like, do we really need to be specific about the width of the window trim when we're talking about trying to build housing, in the Oregon Homes program that moves right into right into the approval and right into construction. So this is where we begin to have that conversation of like, what is falling to the wayside? What is remaining in the wheelbarrow when we take that shovel and, take the best design standards for the purposes of, balancing quality of life, access to nature, those kind of things, while also not upsetting the, the development feasibility of those Oregon homes in the first place. So
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. And I wonder, we have a number of hands up, if folks can think about it, and Ethan, correct me if I'm misrepresenting. Part of the essence of this conversation is these things are essential because, right? And versus, right, I mean, Jill, I appreciate the last example of like, we should not, like things that are not essential like eaves because is helpful. But I think what I hear you asking is, what are the things that are essential and why? Right? Because that's the scoop out of the wheelbarrow, maybe, right? So, I think it's helpful to folks to name, the things that are important or maybe less important. That is helpful. I think it's really important that we're naming the things that are essential to include because fill in the blank. Does that make sense? So let's go. I think we got Brock, then Kathy, Sarah, Diego, Nora, Fred, and then we'll probably have to take a break. And move into another big conversation we have. But Brock, jump in.
Yeah, I just want to circle back to what Alexandra noted in her comment earlier. What we're talking about in this rulemaking, right, is like siting and development standards. We at the intro of this conversation said we're not talking about the aspects of the building itself, no visual aspects, anything like that. What we're talking about is where on the lot it is, maybe orientation, right? But we're not talking about trim, we're not talking about eaves, we're not talking about, roof design or facade materials or anything like that. We're just talking about how it fits on the lot. Going into those kind of more building specific details, that's BCD's scope, not our scope here.
I think that's correct.
Right.
Was that just a clarifying question, or do you have other thoughts around what we should be saying is essential? Well, you got your hand up.
Well, I think that there is some confusion still around what we're talking about, and maybe it's just because of the language that we're using. Like if we can put the word design standards or the term design standards completely out of our minds for now and just say siting and development standards, I think that would be helpful because even though we might define it a certain way in the rule when we're talking about design standards, just like as a group here, I think it leads to some confusion.
Sure.
So that may be helpful for folks. Yeah, jump in, Ethan.
Really what I think there is maybe a false setup or distinction, a distinction without a difference, maybe between things like the like bulk and scale, which, you know, is, I would say, something along the lines of design standards that kind of regulate those versus the things like how many parking spaces are required, for example, which doesn't seem like a design standards. That seems like something different. And so, yeah, I'll take the critique about structuring the conversation under a dichotomy that is maybe unnecessary. But I think like those are the kinds of things that we need to discuss here in the rulemaking context of like how does a local government review, like what are the things that they're reviewing against, what are the standards that they're reviewing against to approve the like actual unit, the structure itself on the site, where it fits, how it's structured, how imposing it is to the neighboring site. Like those kind of things are on offer here when we're having this discussion.
But to your point, Brock, I think if folks are thinking about it, maybe using the language of development, right? Like what are you developing versus the design, which is getting to some of these other attributes that are kind of outside and more in the building codes piece that maybe is just helpful for us all to hold.
Yeah, because like design standards, like where my brain is going with that is Senate Bill 974, Section 8, right? So facade, roof decoration, entry door and garage materials, window elements, fence type, architectural details, porches and balconies, variety of floor plans, and landscaping.
Yeah.
That's design. I think the rest of it is development and siting.
Fair. Well, that's hopefully that's helpful for folks as we continue the conversation. Let's go, Sarah, then Diego.
I think I was next, but I lowered my
Oh,
hand.
Kathy, sorry. Yes, I look at the hands and I forget. Jump in, please.
I was just going to add that because there's a lot of discussion in some of these, that maybe we should put some questions in the chat, that not everything is a discussion, and then maybe you can develop a list of things that you'll get back to us on. Because I haven't seen us use the chat, and I don't know if your intention is to not and just have it all be discussion, but I think there could be a lot of questions just added there for future discussion. And
What I would thank you, Kathy. So part of the reason we don't use the chat is because it's a Zoom kind of webinar, the public wouldn't be able to see it. But if folks want to put questions in the chat, I will read them out just as, not as they come in, but I'll read them out broadly for follow-up, either in the meeting or after the meeting. Is that okay? Partly that, but the reason we're not using chat is so it's not visible to the public. So we're really trying to keep substantive stuff out there, but we could collect questions. That's not a bad idea. Thank you, Kathy. Sarah?
Thank you, Ben. Okay, I've got a couple of things. In the interest of time, I'm just going to rattle this stuff off. Okay, so first one, I think part of the confusion is that there are site development standards in terms of structural components that are embedded in zoning codes. So I know you're trying to decouple those standards, but the reality is there are several zoning districts that do require eaves. They may have facade requirements embedded within their zoning development standards. That being said, I think the other thing that is missing from the discussion questions are lot coverage maximums and floor area ratios. Those are two things that are also part of zoning standards. I appreciate what was said about the suggestions. The only thing I would also caution is outside of well-developed urban areas, you need your garage and your parking in the front because that is your access to your only street. So I think incorporating design standards that allow a home or a footprint to be rotated, right, is really important. The other option would be the state taking a very bold step forward and just telling us all from a zoning perspective what our design standards in terms of zoning are going to be moving forward. Because I think what is quickly happening is the realization that we're just not going to be able to get everything for everyone. And if you really want this program to launch, maybe it's beyond this discussion and saying, communities, these are your setbacks. This is what you will regulate through zoning, and this is where you will not. The other thing that I would say to that is part of my other concern, just from a process standpoint, is that where does the customer go first? Jurisdictions are also designed very differently. Sometimes your planning and your building folks are together, and sometimes they're not. So does a customer go get the plans first? Do they talk to the planners first? Do they talk to the building department first? Because if they don't know where to go first, and if your planning and building staff are not communicating, which I will say is typical, if this isn't set up in a way to where a customer understands that they have to make those 3 stops before, they could go through the state process, pick up some plans in good faith, take that money, take that time, spend that money, and then they still have 2 more stops. And one may say yes, but one may say no. So I think as this process and this program is being developed, there needs to be a guide or something for customers as well, because we cannot assume that everybody's communicating, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you. Diego?
Hi, just a few points since there's been so much conversation, but on Jill's point for ADUs, this brought up an interesting point from the actual text of the bill itself, where it does mention that in Section 4A does say that accessory dwelling units are allowed, but under the site eligibility, it actually can't have, to my understanding, an occupied residence because it must be vacant, or if there is a home there, it must be that was demolished within the previous 5 years. It has to provide net new units. But just looking at the bill text, it doesn't seem like this is actually applicable for someone who's an existing resident and wants to add an ADU in their backyard.
I'll have to take that
Ethan,
one. Yeah, I'll have to take that one with me, Diego, and take a look at that. The so okay. In terms of the back to Jill's question about what we're talking about, I just wanted to highlight, draw these connections, because what we're talking about in terms of DLCD's rulemaking scope, we are talking about the Section 4 of Section 2, subsection 4, those housing types, when we're talking about establishing the regulatory framework. So all of those things in subsection 4, attached or detached housing, including accessory dwelling units, your question, Diego, aside, or prefabricated and modular housing, types with a buildable area of, there's a couple of specifics there, multi-unit dwellings with more than 6 and fewer than 12 units, and D and E, housing that complies with the minimum density requirements and the pre-approval that building codes would provide. So those are the housing types that we're talking about here in terms of the scope of the housing types that we would apply these Oregon home standards to. Diego, I don't have an answer to your question. It's a good one, and I commit to following up with you.
Certainly. The second point was actually something that you just covered, where I believe it was Jill or someone previously that had brought up that this was for houses or ADUs, which also I wanted to remind the floor that this is actually covering apartment buildings with 11 units and less, which is also rather important for considering setbacks and I believe the recent guidance on single stair buildings that because this is also limited to lots under 20,000 square feet, it's actually only going to be likely a single stair and smaller form factors for apartment buildings that can include that area. And then supporting, Ethan, your previous comment on the lean towards having these design requirements be as geared towards production as possible, because there's already a lot of restrictions with the actual amount of lots that are going to be eligible for this. I believe less than 20,000 square feet and at least 1,500 square feet. Something like a side setback might preclude a builder from doing townhomes on sites that are already platted. And even if there are the best of intentions with applying something like window trim or glaze, it could potentially have consequences that were unintended down the line when builders may decide the friction is just too much to, I suppose, bother with the program.
Awesome. Thank you, Diego. So let's go Fred, Shane, Morgan, Cheryl, then I gotta draw a line, send you on a break, and we have a whole other conversation we need to have. So Fred, jump in.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm just going to push back on the whole design versus development standards conversation a little bit. It says in the bill itself, applicable design standards and the scope of the design review, which may include requiring the approval of the use of any material design or other method of construction. It seems to me like that is pretty broad, and it can include things like glazing standards. And so some of the things that Jill said, they're very common across jurisdictions throughout the state, like the Oregon Model Home Code, Home Model Code, or whatever your DLCD put out, has the 15% window requirement. It has the 50%, no more than 50% of the lot frontage be in a driveway. Standards like that are pretty basic and they make a whole lot of sense. Another one that I would throw in too is not having the garage stick out in front of the house. Again, some of these are for safety, neighborliness, quality of life, all those sorts of things. The other thing that I'll throw out that folks have not talked about at all is what to do with collector and arterial streets. Sometimes those streets require driveway spacing standards that if we do not consider those, we will not, they will not be addressed by the Oregon Home approval of an Oregon home. So I think that's pretty much my thought.
Thank you, Shane.
An analogy check and then a question about the scope of specifics within here. The first is I'm trying to understand like between the building itself and then the proportions of the lot. So my analogy is that if living is a buffet and life is food, then each lot is a table and a neighborhood is a potluck. And what we're trying to do is figure out what is allowed on the table, how many dishes, what is the size of the platter, and how does that relate to the table, and how can you access the table? We're not saying specifically what dish cannot be allowed. What we're stating is, like, if you have a plate this big and then you're trying to roast a whole suckling pig, that's not going to fit on that dish, right? So again, and then for Oregon homes, it seems like this is like a cake batter mix, like a box mix or food or stuffing. So it's offering these things that can assist one to fill the dish that may be a standard, but again, it does not preclude the ways in which we can have variances of adding our flavor to the dish. You add fresh strawberries in the cake, right? Am I getting that?
I see Ethan shaking his head.
I love the analogy. I think it's helpful to illustrate, I think, the importance of, or that distinction between what we're talking about here. We are talking about like how that platter fits on the table, and less talking about what dish you need to bring to.
Okay. All right, awesome, thank you. Yeah. And then clarifying question before I give a recommendation. When it says landscaping within siding designs, what is the purview of landscaping?
So oftentimes local governments will regulate the screening of particular auxiliary uses or auxiliary structures or buildings, or like the parking lot, for example. Some jurisdictions even regulate the kinds of landscaping, plants, foliage that would be required in that screening, or how much tree cover or green space needs to be on the site.
So it's not just tree siting standards and diameter, breast height. It's actually more than, oh my God, thank you. Yes. Okay, great. I can't talk about unit topology. Here is a quality of life statement that's general about Portland and Oregon. And then here's what I will say specific in recommendations. I have met people from Manhattan, LA, San Francisco. They come to Oregon, and what do they state? Oh my goodness, it's so green. And when I move to a neighborhood and there's a climate crisis, I have mature trees where they have gently grazing eaves of leaves that greet my face as I meet the dawn, right? I need to stress the crappiest looking building can look like a renaissance if there is a beautiful garden in front. This also goes to screening and privacy as well as access and circulation. You can easily put a concrete pad of a bioswale, which includes bamboo, which is invasive, but if you put it in a concrete bioswale, you get this tall grass that sways in the wind. It adds more to the urban canopy, things like that. All I'm stating is we're so focused on the building, but if we're looking at the lot and the relationship of siting and design standards, we have to consider how urban forestry as well as permacultural design not only increases the bioavailability for pollinators in our region, which is important, it's also creating more resiliency as well as climate resiliency, especially in neighborhoods that are disproportionately Black, poor, immigrant, that get more heat strokes. They don't have the access to the same nature. Literally, if you have an urban canopy versus not, you can add $600 a month to that rental unit. And so, and when I saw in Division, they put the bus line rapid transit in, oh, cool, they put street trees in. But guess what? They didn't water them. They're all dead now. That's not only disgusting for the people. For me as an animist, it's vile that we put trees somewhere saying they could grow and give life to us, and then we don't steward them. So I really stress the way that we relate to plants and how that's in the space and relationship to our buildings can increase the quality of life in such a dramatic way. So I'm just stressing that.
Awesome. Thank you, Shane. Let's go Morgan, Cheryl, then I'm going to send us on a break and I'm going to ask for some very focused conversation coming out of that. Morgan, jump in.
All right. Another brain dump from another city planner. So just talking about some of the development standards, I think Jill's comment about pedestrian access, you know, the pathway connection between the street and the unit is probably a good idea. I'm not sure how nitpicky we need to get for the smaller like house types, but as we get more units on the lot, we probably need to think about that, especially in terms of accessibility. So the width and the surfacing of those pathways. We need to talk about minimum dwelling unit density. That's part of our part of DLCD's charge, so I don't want to worry about that one. Floor area ratio is also covered in the statute, and we'll probably have some discussion about that. Height seems to relate to the structure, so I'm not going to touch that, but I think there might be potentially some relationship when we're talking in terms of setbacks. It might be based on the height of the structure, so something to think about. We should be contemplating, in addition to Shane's comments around landscaping, building coverage. This is important for our stormwater infrastructure, and leaving place for landscaping and trees. We need to address tree preservation as part of the statute bills. I have a note here about main entrances and agreeing with Sarah's comment that even though it's sort of related to the structure could be rotated to make sure the front door faces the street. So maybe that's not totally precluded in our conversation. Street facing facades, I'll leave that out. And required outdoor areas, I think in addition to the building coverage, we want to ensure that there's a usable space for outdoor recreation. This is important, not just to high income households, but everybody. So just put that on the list. And then parking, for Portland, we don't have parking requirements, but it's not really a consideration for us. But I think the comment about arterial and collector streets, I think this is going to lead into our next conversation around variances and when we allow those parking requirements to be more flexible. All right, that's it. Thank you.
All right, nice. Cheryl.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted, as we were talking about setbacks, a couple of things that are a little bit different because we have areas in Clackamas County that are more infill, and then we have some unusual places where we are not on public utilities. Just something to consider when we're talking about setting just absolutely hard setbacks. We have things like flag lots or lots that are accessed by easements or lots that are curved on the side. We have a lot of conversation about which is the front lot line. So we just want to be careful in that to make sure we're not getting ourselves in a box where we can't determine those. I also want to call in that, we do have some UGB lands that would be under this, that we do need area for a septic system. We can't have a complete lot coverage if we lose the septic area on the lot. So something to be mindful of. And then lastly, kind of in that right of way setback, I think kind of we, both Tillamook and Portland were talking about this. Right of way needs to be included for utility access to the site. So making sure that front setback can accommodate utilities. But also I know even in Portland, I live Southeast Portland, we got streets that we're getting half street improvements now. And so we want to have enough room to go ahead and put in future sidewalks, half street, other improvements. So we're not just like real close to that front lot line.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. So I generally want to give folks 10 minutes, so I'm going to do it. But that means we're going to come back at 11:15 and we have a pretty deep conversation to have. So let's take 10 minutes. We're going to come back 11:15 and I'm going to ask you all to focus in like you've never focused in before. So we can have a robust conversation and hear from everybody. So let's see you at 11:15. Okay, starting to see some faces come back. I know we got about 35 more seconds. Gives me a chance to have one more Cheez-It for those that know how much I love a Cheez-It. Getting through my day. Either are you using any slides to recap or, okay, so let's bring up the discussion slides. And I was only half joking when I said to really focus in. We only got about 35, 40 minutes for this conversation. And Ethan, if you want to just provide a little bit of context, we'll just jump into the conversation.
Okay, sounds good. Welcome back, everyone. All right, so for this conversation, we've already gotten into some of those, like, it's different here, or there are reasons why it might be, we can't have this standardized standard, for example. And there is opportunity that's articulated in House Bill 2258 to consider those situations that might require a deviation from the standardized set of standards that local governments apply under the Oregon Homes Program. And I think for the purposes of today's conversation, it would be helpful to, from a baseline understanding, just start from the premise that there are going to be situations, we don't have to run through all the examples, but there are going to be situations where there's some sort of differentiation or different circumstance that might require or that might present a situation where the standardized approach is just not going to work. And let's just start from that, like, reality, because it is a reality, and enter the variance and adjustment process. And I would ask us to think about the situations that rise to the level of warranting the opportunity for a builder to vary from the standards. I provided some of those examples, slope, for an example, or the outcomes-based approach of we're getting something more for this variance or this adjustment to the standardized set of regulations. And to think through, like, what is the rationale that a builder might need to make to secure that adjustment? Like, what kind of information might they need to provide? What, if we're focusing on that kind of outcomes-based approach, is it just if you're providing more units, do you get a variance? Like, how much variance do you get? How much adjustment do you get? And what do those processes look like? How would that actually function, rather than, and here's my request, rather than focusing on the instances that might lead to a variance or might warrant a variance. If we could try to toe that line, that would be super helpful. Let's just start from the premise that there are unique circumstances across the state and that the standardized approach is not going to account for all of them. Let's think through the reasons why we would grant an adjustment and variance. So hopefully that is a helpful cue up. Also, just reiterate my point that variance and adjustments are not for the cities to vary from the standards, but for builders to vary from the standardized Oregon Homes approach. Just make that point one last time. So that's my cue up for this discussion, Ben.
Thanks, Ethan. So that may lend itself for some of the builders, developers in the room to lead off this conversation, but so I'll invite those folks in to start, and then just kind of invite others to jump in as well. So maybe just starting with, there's builders, to Ethan's final point or last point, for some of our builder developer folks. Any reflections on kind of the rationale, the function, Brock?
Yeah, I know this is not a popular one with everybody, but I think if we're looking for a list of the standards that might need variance, I think section 38 of House Bill, or gosh, Senate Bill 1537. I know there's a lot around process for, people that are cities that are requesting exemption from that section and whatnot, but I think if we're just looking for a list of the things that might want to be considered here that encompasses a lot of it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think just to kind of shine a little bit of light on that, for folks who aren't familiar with 1537, there's a bill that was passed in the 2024 legislative session that outlines a list of adjustments that cities must grant. It's called it's generally known as the mandatory adjustment provisions. In that bill, it does articulate the kinds of adjustments, and that's what Brock is speaking to. That provides like a list for us to reference, or might provide some good source material for this conversation as well. So good call out. Thanks, Brock.
Yep. Oh, I know I put builders on the spot, so let's just open it up. If folks have thoughts around the information, outcomes, circumstances. Yeah, Miracle.
Sorry, and I hope I don't send us down a rabbit hole or rabbit holes like last discussion, but I think of variances as something that's needed because the lot itself is odd, unique, something like that, as opposed to, say, certain locations of coastal communities need setbacks because of what they're setting back from, right? Or they might need a higher standard of glass because of the wind and the salt air, that sort of thing. We're not, and I realize I just probably bled into building codes, but that like that setback thing that I just meant. So those apply like across the board, certain siting standards across the board in an area because of something. We're not talking about a variance from that. We're talking about because this particular lot is different. Is that right?
I would say yes to that
Okay.
question. Yeah.
That just helps me think about this and maybe precludes other rabbit holes. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Jill?
I'm representing builders, so I guess I'm trying to come up with something for you. I mean, I guess the thing that's on my mind is is just if there's the rule about not being able to back out of your driveway on certain kinds of collectors. I'm just wondering if maybe there is a variance that could take into consideration how many other existing buildings on the property already do that, or on the lot, on the block, say, already back out. Or a variance if there was already a driveway that was being used and you're redeveloping something and maintaining that same driveway, if there could be a variance for that. Is that sort of information that's helpful for you guys?
Maddie, I see your hand up.
It is, Jill. In fact, Cheryl, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you listed a few lot specific characteristics that you didn't want us to, I guess I'll use the word foreclose, and maybe you could restate those. And one of them had to do with a flag lot. Maybe you could get back to that and bring that into this part of the conversation.
Sure, because I think the variances may play here. We have a lot of flag lots that are infill, in fact, quite a few of them. Lots that are accessed by an easement, so they have an entrance agreement with their neighbor to get to that lot, but they don't have a front lot line. Or lots that are curved. We have a number of ones that are on some kind of curve, and then we don't have a front. I got a piece of pie. Those are ones that are very challenging for us for trying to figure out even where is the front of the property. So that would need some assistance if we're going to say you must have, 10-foot setback and we want to build to that. Trying to figure that out is pretty challenging.
Ethan, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I think those are great examples of things that we should bring into this conversation of like how do we just reconcile that? Like how are local governments reviewing those unique circumstances and how much deviation might be allowed to accommodate those circumstances. One of the examples that I used is, and Cheryl, this is one of the things that you mentioned, there's an access easement or some maybe a utility easement or something like that. You literally cannot place a building that encroaches into that easement for the reasons of the importance of easements. So if that shifts the development out of that easement, do we want to accommodate some sort of encroachment into the otherwise standardized setback that might be applied to all of the other Oregon home developments that might take place on a lot that did not have an easement, for example? And the kind of question is, if yes, then how much? Those are the kinds of conversations that we, or the answers to the questions that we'll have to come up with here in this rulemaking process. Yeah, Morgan, I'm sure you've got lots of experience here.
I was just going to reflect back on Brock's comment, and as much of a fan as I'm not of Senate Bill 1537, I think that is a good list to start from. I am a big fan of consistency, so that bill already has some limits, or what's the amount of waiver you can request sort of automatically, and to the extent that we can sort of follow that pattern, that just creates a little less confusion and makes things a little simpler for the implementer. So I actually am going to echo Brock on that one. Look at 1537. There's a good place to start there, but we might want to think about things that are, because that's sort of all encompassing of multiple bigger types of residential construction too. So there might be some more nuanced things for the smaller scale development.
Thanks, Morgan. Jill, would you come back up? Lee?
Yeah. I thought of another one. Sometimes what's tricky to figure out is if you have a project with multiple units where you need some kind of accessory structure in order to meet a requirement, like for trash or bike parking. Some jurisdictions, it depends on the zone you're in, you're not allowed to have that be in front or like within 40 feet of the front property line. I don't know, I may be getting away from the scope, but I think maybe just somehow if there's a way to allow for variances for accessory structures if they're under a certain size, and if they're providing a required use, like that, if they could somehow be closer to the front property line, like as long as they weren't in front of another main structure.
I think this is a good example, if I could, Ben, of like a question of should we or should we not endeavor down that level of specificity in this program? Because I think there are, and then also what kind of case would an applicant need to make to seek that adjustment, right? Like if it's based on, well, I have to put the trash enclosure within that 40-foot like buffer because otherwise I literally can't fit the 3 units on the site. The geometry doesn't allow it. Like, is that justification enough? Are we thinking about it in that terms, or is it just you can have it's 40-foot standard, but if you put it at 35 feet off the street, that's fine because it's within 15% of the baseline standard? Or are we thinking about that? I think those are kind of two different approaches to how the variance program could be utilized and implemented, which is a question that I'm throwing back at the group of what is the case that applicants make for seeking and invoking those variances and adjustments?
Lee? Can't hear you.
It's a little soft, yeah.
Now you're muted.
How about now?
Oh, yes.
Oh, there we go. All right.
Here.
I think, and we mostly build in the Portland metro area. And I think landscaping is a big one, would be a big one for us, attempting to fit one of these homes onto a site, and that coming into conflict with, say, the number of trees we are required to plant on a site, or the depth of the buffer plantings that we might be required to put on a site, or any trees that we might be required to preserve on a site. I know that in 1537 there is a mandatory landscape adjustment, but it's kind of general. It's just percentage based.
And Lee, is that, again, like that's something to be considered, but is there more specificity in terms of what you're putting forward?
I mean, I thought that the question was, what are the circumstances builders might need to need a variance to site an Oregon home? One of the circumstances is the landscape requirements from the jurisdiction are in conflict with our ability to site that home on a particular lot. Is that not the question?
I think it is. Yeah, Ethan.
Yeah, definitely. I think the maybe Ben, your question was like, is the landscaping requirements that you're saying are in conflict with the ability to site due to just that you have to have landscaping, or is there like some element of that?
I think, yes, that's what I was trying to get at, right? Is it a conflict with the landscaping requirements themselves, or is there, like, we could build another unit if it wasn't for that? Or it's that but-for question, Ethan, I think you were trying to get at in the pre-work.
It's a conflict with the specifics of landscaping requirements. Yeah, so it's okay, on a site this size, you are required to plant 10 new trees. Well, if I plant 10 new trees in such a way that they're not all going to die in the first year, then I don't have room to put a house on this site.
Okay.
Helpful.
Eddie?
Can I ask a follow-up question, Lee? Is when you mentioned the percentage landscaping criterion, do you feel that is adequately general, that it could help? You know, if we were to say that Oregon home siting didn't have all of those criteria that you just described about depth of plantings and whatever, it just had to do with a percentage, would that type of approach be more advantageous for the work that you do?
I haven't found the 1537 mandatory adjustment to be useful in any project so far with respect to the landscaping adjustment.
Okay.
We've still had to go through a different adjustment route to be able to fit developments onto particular sites and not have trees planted on top of sanitary and water lines, as an example.
Okay.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Cheryl?
Just as we're talking about variances, and I know that Ethan, you were saying, you know, could we allow some type of encroachments into setbacks or areas? I just want to make sure we're careful not to allow encroachments into easements or things like that, where it's a hard line with another property, because we wouldn't want to inadvertently start that challenge. I think that's something to consider if we're going to be granting variances. And somebody else from another jurisdiction said clarity and variances. If we have a lot of different really challenging things, that clear and objective is really important. We need clarity on how we can implement these variances, so we're not trying to recreate the wheel with a bunch of variances.
Right. Yeah. And I think I'll just say yes to, we're not really talking about easements here or variances to those. And also that's one of the approaches that was used in 1537 was there's a nominal or sometimes percentage, amount of variance that you get, deviation that you get, so that maintains that clear and objective. Like the setback might be 10% or 10 feet, but you get a 25% deviation for reasons to encroach on that setback. So like definitively what that number is, and it's not dependent on how well you make the case, for example.
That's good. Fred?
Yeah, just a quick sort of clarifying question, because I think that some of maybe I'm getting a little confused here. So when we're talking about an Oregon home plan, are we talking about the plan itself? Or are we talking about a plan that includes like sort of associated amenities like parking, like accessory garages or trash enclosures or stuff? Because I think depending on what we're talking about, the potential variances that we're talking about varies quite significantly.
Yeah, so it would be the site plan and all the things included therein. Things like, I think it does include the parking areas or trash enclosures, those kind of things, because they might be, they're related to the development application that local government is reviewing for approval.
So Fred, if it's the site plan and all things included therein, does that?
Yeah, I think it just makes it way more complicated, because I mean the amount that you're trying to fit onto a site then is, and we're talking about a different size site then. If we're talking about the building itself, potentially it could apply a number of different places. But if we're talking about the associated amenities with that development, then all of a sudden it gets way more complicated to fit it onto a site. I think. And so, yeah, the level of variances and whatnot that might apply, I think significantly expands.
Yeah. Shane?
Two things. One, a general point about the discussion. Two, something reflecting from Lee, because I really appreciate Lee's commentary about how plants, for example, could limit development. First, in the general nature of the discussion, I'm looking at what are the kinds of standards that we should consider offering variances or adjustments for. I have absolute ignorance in so many aspects of development and building. So when I come to that question, I come from a generalized justice perspective of, we know we need housing for people. We know we need different kinds of housing. And the way that that housing is built will have a quality of life impact currently and in the future, I think, in that model. And so when I think of variances, especially for builders who are responsible for stewarding this future and have to deal with all of these limitations, I feel variances should always come down to, is this wiggle room allowing existence to occur, period? Because I do never want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, but I will admit this idea of good being the enemy of the practical, I really want us to massage what is pragmatism and practicality in the age that we're in. For example, conversation about eaves, I will directly state, I don't care. My existence, I would love to live in some of the communities that we are discussing, but when it comes right down to it, I have been homeless and I have made gardens that have had more stable realities than my existence. So when it comes to this discussion and going to say the plant thing, I never want any of our requirements to limit existence and limit possibility. And I feel that there's a generalized anxiety in this conversation that we're trying to figure out what are the rules and the requirements which allow existence and wiggle room. If the wiggle room exists, say, for example, percentage variances on setback, or where is the siding standard versus where a trash can is supposed to be, then I go specifically to plants, right? Because what I've learned from plants over and over is, from the tiniest of Irish mosses to the grandest of redwoods, all you need to give plants is the ability to set their roots in some part of the landscape. I think that applies to this discussion when we come to variances and standards. What are we trying to make allowed and exist and a lot? And how can we have wiggle room and variance so that we can have as many standards as possible while not precluding existence itself? Because that is perfect being the enemy of the good. That's my commentary.
Thanks, Shane.
Yeah, and
I'll jump in, Nathan.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that is the fundamental question of when we've had a lot of discussion about things that, for this reason or that reason are important considerations. But when it comes down to the Oregon Homes program, it is intentionally to look different in terms of the standards and the, approval processes and those kind of things that are applied to really turn the dial on the expeditiousness and the development feasibility of units for people to live in. And there are other standards that might be applied to other housing types that just don't find themselves in the Oregon Homes Program, because they are they don't fit within that narrow framework of, let's think about, how do we move these development applications as quick and seamlessly as we can into approval.
That's great. I appreciate it, just, Shane, you regrounding us in kind of the equity and outcomes framework that we started with. Let's go, Eric, and then Diego.
Thanks, Ben. Just to answer from a local jurisdiction standpoint, number 3, like what should we consider in approving or denying? Safety, of course. I think that's number 1 always on our mind. Is it going to result in a safety issue? And I know building code we're trying to push that out, but basically to me that gets back to building code. So if we're going to approve a variance, then that home would still need to comply with the building code, basically. And I think that's fairly straightforward, based on setbacks and firewalls and things like that. And then just, I guess, a comment, getting back to the sort of this process also determining site planning requirements, I guess, or allowances, if you will. I guess my only thought of like who might not be in the room right now, that there are a few, but trash providers, interestingly, and I know in Sherwood, Pride Disposal they have like really strict standards. So I'm just thinking of a situation where an Oregon multifamily site plan is kind of blessed through the Oregon home process, and then you have a trash provider with very specific and very expensive equipment that might not be able to serve that site. And so what happens in that situation? Maybe it's a variance at that point to the trash standard. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, good call out, and DLCD, something to put on your list as a stakeholder to engage with. Diego.
Just a really quick reinforcement of like a previous point, but tying off to some of the other comments that have been made is just as a framing for context as we decide on like how relaxed or how tight to make these variance rules, is that permits for all housing units inside of Portland city limits have collapsed 74% between 2021 and 2025, and it's just this is one of the programs where to actually get back to a reasonable level of housing production, I think, is really just an area where we should be leaning towards production over even the model code. As a response to someone made to my previous comment, which is very lenient. It does provide quite a lot of excellent guidance. Maybe we should still even be exploring what can be done beyond then, or beyond that point.
Awesome. Thank you, Diego. Love to invite, if we haven't heard from you today or recently, I'd just love to invite anyone who hasn't had a chance or sought the opportunity to give any reflection, input, either on this section or the previous section. Yeah, Alexandra?
I'll just kind of drop a flag in the sand, which is, I think, what variances look like somewhat depends on what the siting and development standards are, because, obviously those are the things you're going to have to strongly account for in this. I think Eric makes a strong point of like, at the end of the day, what information and like what circumstances merit a denial. Like Eric said, it's going to be safety and things, you know, that we don't necessarily account for in this room. Trash is a good example of that, of like, how will these units actually work? How do we make these units that people want to live in? Like, we are in a housing crisis right now, but we have to think to some degree about the future and like what happens to this housing supply in the long term, and making it like actually viable housing that is part of our communities. So like, I think there is some question of like, okay, if we put the citing standards here, we have to put the variance standards here, but you can even those two things out between each other to give some kind of balance for both jurisdictions and the developer, to allow a little bit more A, oversight, and B, wiggle room for the developer, not for the jurisdiction. Let's be so.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the path that we're seeking to go down, or the balance we're seeking to strike, which is both in invoking both your comments, Alexandra, and yours, Diego, and even your, Shane, of there are some instances, I think, where the Oregon Homes program will not apply particular standards in using the justification or the rationale that where this program is intended to be that expeditious, light review kind of program. And, we may not have a standard related to, I don't know, pick your favorite one, in the base kind of set of standards. But when we talk about variances to accommodate or allow that flexibility and allow those kind of unique situations to actually still have access to the Oregon Homes program, we're trying to think through what are those instances actually, what are they? Is it mostly related to easements or like the geographic or the geometric elements of the site? Is that really what we're talking about? Or are we also talking about like we should allow additional development outcomes because we can get that kind of third unit or that fourth unit if we forego something like the landscaping requirements to a certain extent? Like those are the big questions that we're going to be wrestling with in developing the rules, and having your feedback on those. Whether we landed in the right balance is going to be incredibly critical to actually striking the balance that you're speaking to, Alexandra.
Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, Jim, jump in.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this emanates particularly from my world of work, but when on the previous discussion we talk about safety for the residents and the neighbors in the community, the inclusion of the R327 fire hardening standards, where that might fall into place for consideration in the broad spectrum of all the work. I will share that in our world, any and all of our reconstruction projects do include that as a matter of course based on funding sources. And so we've thus designed all of our models, 33 home units have been designed to those standards. So we'll lift that up as a, if not now, potentially when, conversation point. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Open up for any last comments before we kind of begin the transition to closing. Okay. I will note I had to Google Rainbow City. It's a place in Alabama. There is a real city called Rainbow City in Alabama. So maybe not a real reference, but a real place. So just FYI. Mary Kyle.
Sorry, Jim's comment made me think of something I was going to bring up earlier. But it also relates to wildfire preparedness standards, and that's not so much the building, but defensible space and vegetation choices. And there are cities well, at least Ashland, maybe others that have very specific requirements for what you can and can't plant because of wildfire susceptibility and that sort of thing, and also defensible space. So those all go into safety. I think they're about the lot as opposed to the building, and they go into safety. So anyway, I would want to make sure those are not waived.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can I ask a ignorant question? I mean, I think Eric, you talked a little bit about context earlier. Like in that example, Mary Kyle, like I don't know how this group thinks about future potential rules, right? So I could see defensible, right, wildfire risk mitigation as whether it exists now, I just don't know. Or I could see that.
Unfortunately, it doesn't, at least on
Okay,
a
so-
statewide basis.
Yeah, okay. Do you see that? I guess like that gets
Yeah.
back to some of this
There
context.
are, yes, there
this
are
group be-
local jurisdictions that have adopted already and are probably will in the future adopt defensible space and vegetation standards and R327 requirements, but that's the building envelope. So, and I don't want to preclude those or have them waived.
Yeah. Maybe but I'm just asking just because I don't know the extent or the possibility for this group to think about the type of conversations that are happening now in a context of something that may happen in the future and how much you try to hold that as a body or try to build it into this discussion was both a point of curiosity, but also responsive to, I think, Jim, your comment and Mary Kyle. So Ethan and then Alexander, I saw you had your hand, or Alexander, jump in.
Yeah, so just to Mary Kyle's point, like these are regulations that cities are already putting in place. Like this is something that already exists to some extent, and it's definitely not like, I think the Ashland, the Talents, former OHCS used to work with the disaster recovery team a lot. Those communities really have been looking at their siting standards and their landscaping standards and all of those as like a way to prevent future displacement of their community, a way to protect their low income residents, a way to like protect the people who live there. And so especially as we're looking at some of those more like the setbacks to some extent, because that can be part of defensible space, also those landscaping requirements, like I think that's something that we have to account for in the core rule and then make some kind of like regulation for in the variance process of like we have to account for like there are certain ways in which we can't account for the variance across communities in Oregon. Like it just isn't possible under the framework of this bill, but it is something that you can account for in the variance process of saying like certain levels of wildfire risk are an acceptable reason for denial for the waiving of whatever landscaping standard.
Yeah. I think that's where I was going, Alexander, is that kind of fourth bullet, like, does this kind of fall into that like life safety risk that is to such an extent that it warrants a denial versus a variance approval? Ethan, jump in.
I think, right. I think this is like the kind of conversation that I was hoping we would get into today of like, what are the, I'm going to use the wrong word, like de minimis kinds of standards that we might apply to all of the Oregon Homes program. Like if we are looking for a setback, one way, a standardized setback, using this example, if we're looking for a standardized setback, do we tie that to some sort of like policy rationale that is based on defensible space standards or like best practices? Or do we, to account for that, have to think about that in some other portion of this program either through the variance or adjustments or whatever else, the approval process, for example, like how does that get accounted for? And one way to do that is just have that be the baseline setback standard. The other is to think about it as an opportunity for that to be considered at some other stage in the program. But if we could all throw around a setback number, but it's all kind of arbitrary unless we tie it to something that's like grounded in balancing these goals of unit production, fire life safety, all of that kind of stuff. So what's going to kind of win the day, I suppose, in terms of how you queue up what that baseline standard is?
Yeah, thanks, Mary Kyle.
So would this be an example of what you're talking about, Ethan? If a community has a particular setback requirement that's related to wildfire reduction, risk reduction, but a particular lot, you can't site the housing on it because of that setback, because of the nature of that lot. But a balancing of that would then be to require whatever's built on that lot to use the R327 building code if it's not otherwise required by that city. So you're still addressing the wild, and I'm not saying this is a good idea. I mean, this is beyond just me thinking, talking about this, but a balancing of there's a wildfire risk reduction issue that's there. And if the setback precludes building anything on that lot, can it be mitigated by requiring the wildfire resilient building code to be applied if it's not already required? Is that just the kind of thing you're trying to get at? It's more my example than suggesting it as the way to go, but.
Yeah, or is that how important of a factor is that to consider? And I think is like
right
the fundamental question. If it's uber very, very very important, then it should be just the baseline standard. But if it gets accommodated in somewhere else in the process, either maybe the variance is in the right place, but like how do you set that baseline standard, and then what are the reasons for deviating from that?
Okay.
All right, Sarah and Morgan, you're going to be the last two, and I'm cutting off. No hands up, no more hands for today. Sarah?
Thank you, Ben. I guess for me, I would just caution using the word variance. Maybe it's an alternative design standard, just because variances require public notice. There's a lot of pieces of a process that's embedded in the land use program that goes with that. So there may be a better word. The other thing that I would say is if you're looking at like setbacks aren't just for building safety, they can be community character, open space, other pieces in the planning world. And so I just want to honor and recognize that there are other reasons beyond building safety why those are imposed. And I'm not saying that bigger setbacks are better, but just kind of a word of caution to that. And then with that, just pointing out that the type of alternative construction standards that you are referring to may significantly increase the cost of construction of a project. So as we look at what could be alternatives to help with housing production, if trying also to make sure we are not arbitrarily and unintentionally increasing the cost of construction is a result or a cause and effect of that, we may want to look at some other alternatives. Thank you.
Morgan, your final thought for today.
Just a quick one. So it just really around the wildfire risk issue, pointing out that the lots that the Oregon Homes Program is supposed to apply to has a carve out for natural hazards and natural resource areas if they're designated and regulated. So that may still be an issue for local jurisdictions that haven't identified those areas and don't regulate specific areas based on that. But just, maybe we don't need to necessarily drill that far down into that topic.
That's helpful. Yeah, Ethan?
I think I don't necessarily think that this is just a good example to kind of workshop around, because if we're ending up at the end of the day, we're going to have to land on what the setback is and how that relates to development. And one of those considerations is, among many other things, something like defensible space as a reason for why we might land on one number rather than another. And I think the important conversation that we're having right now is like that discussion of, is that the rationale that we want to pin this program upon, or that decision-making process upon? And what are the other things that we should consider? Like if that defensible space standard requires that we have less space for units, we have another problem, which is that we're being more restrictive to the development of, more units. And we need to really weigh that consideration very carefully in the decision-making process here. So not to kind of just to use wildfire and these kind of concepts as a way to have that discussion has been helpful.
Right, well, let's go to the next slide. Ethan, and our
Okay.
minus 1 minute. Do you want
Yes.
to just talk about kind of where we're going and then
Yes.
we'll close this out?
Okay, yeah, a couple of things. We've got our next meeting, I believe that's on April 1st. And we'll be talking about tree removal. We'll actually have 3 modules this time. 1, tree removal, 2nd, approval processes, and we'll talk about variances and whether or not those should require things like public notice. And then also we'll be having we're going to dip our toe into the second bill, HB 2138. We're going to have a conversation about cottage cluster definitions, which is a little bit obviously not part of the Oregon Homes program, but we need to have that conversation to make sure that we're meeting the requirements of 2138 and getting cities things like the definition of cottage cluster in time for them to actually implement those provisions of the bill. So bear with us when we have that conversation. We'll try to make that differentiation between when we're talking about Oregon Homes and when we're talking about cottage clusters very, very clear for you all when we have that conversation, so we know which bill we're speaking to. So just to queue up and heads up about that. And that might be it for today. Sorry, we're already over time.
We are by 1 minute. Appreciate everybody. Thank you. Thanks for the robust conversation. We'll
Thank
see
you
you
very
next
much.
time. We'll try to
Thank
get you
you.
out on time every time. Thank you.
Bye.